found his hair between my fingers. There was a gathering inside me, a beat of blood against the movement of his hand. His face was pressed against me, but I tried to clutch him closer still. "Do not stop," I said. He did not stop. The feeling gathered and gathered till a hoarse cry leapt from my throat, and the sharp flowering drove me, arching against him. It was not enough. My hand reached, found the place of his pleasure. His eyes closed. There was a rhythm he liked. I could feel it, the catch of his breath, the yearning. My fingers were ceaseless, following each quickening gasp. His eyelids were the colour of the dawn sky. He smelled like earth after rain. His mouth opened in an inarticulate cry, and we were pressed so close that I felt the spurt of his warmth against me. He shuddered, and we lay still. Slowly, like dusk fall, I became aware of my sweat, the dampness of the covers and the wetness that slid between our bellies. We separated, peeling away from each other, our faces puffy and half bruised from kisses. The cave smelled hot and sweet, like fruit beneath the sun. Our eyes met, and we did not speak. Fear rose in me, sudden and sharp. This was the moment of truest peril, and I tensed, fearing his regret. He said, "I did not think," and stopped. There was nothing in the world I wanted more than to hear what he had not said. "What?" I asked him. "If it is bad, let it be over quickly." "I did not think that we would ever." He was hesitating over every word, and I could not blame him. "I did not think so either," I said. "Are you sorry?" The words were quickly out of him, a single breath. "I am not," I said. "I am not either." There was silence then, and I did not care about the damp palate or how sweaty I was. His eyes were unwavering, green-flecked with gold. A surety rose in me, lodged in my throat. I will never leave him. It will be this, always, for as long as he will let me. If I had had words to speak such a thing, I would have, but there were none that seemed big enough for it, to hold that swelling truth. As if he had heard me, he reached for my hand. I did not need to look. His fingers were etched into my memory, slender and petal-veined, strong and quick and never wrong. "Patroclus," he said. He was always better with words than I. The next morning I awoke light-headed, my body woozy with warmth and ease. After the tenderness had come more passion. We had been slower then, and lingering, a dreamy night that stretched on and on. Now, watching him stir beside me, his hand resting on my stomach, damp and curled as a flower at dawn, I was nervous again. I remembered in a rush the things I had said and done, the noises I had made. I feared that the spell was broken, that the light that crept through the cave's entrance would turn it all to stone. But then he was awake, his lips forming a half-sleepy greeting, and his hand was already reaching for mine. We lay there, like that, until the cave was bright with morning, and Chiron called. We ate, then ran to the river to wash. I savoured the miracle of being able to watch him openly, to enjoy the play of dappled light on his limbs, the curving of his back as he dove beneath the water. Later, we lay on the riverbank, learning the lines of each other's bodies anew. This and this and this. We were like gods at the dawning of the world, and our joy was so bright we could see nothing else but the other. If Chiron noticed a change, he did not speak of it, but I could not help worrying. "Do you think he will be angry?" We were by the olive grove on the north side of the mountain. The breezes were sweetest here, cool and clean as spring water. "I don't think he will." He reached for my collarbone, the line he liked to draw his finger down. "But he might. Surely he must know by now. Should we say something?" It was not the first time I had wondered this. We had discussed it often, eager with conspiracy. "If you like." That is what he had said before. "You don't think he will be angry?" He paused now, considering. I loved this about him. No matter how many times I had asked, he answered me as if it were the first time. I don't know. His eyes met mine. Does it matter? I would not stop. His voice was warm with desire. I felt an answering flush across my skin. But he could tell your father. He might be angry. I said it almost desperately. Soon my skin would grow too warm, and I would no longer be able to think. So what if he is? The first time he had said something like this, I had been shocked. That his father might be angry, and Achilles would still do as he wished. It was something I did not understand, could barely imagine. It was like a drug to hear him say it. I never tired of it. What about your mother? This was the trinity of my fears. Chiron, Peleus, and Thetis. He shrugged. What could she do? Kidnap me? She could kill me, I thought, but I did not say this. The breeze was too sweet, and the sun too warm for a thought like that to be spoken. He studied me a moment. Do you care if they are angry? Yes, I would be horrified to find Chiron upset with me. Disapproval had always burrowed deep in me. I could not shake it off as Achilles did, but I would not let it separate us if it came to that. No, I told him. Good, he said. I reached down to stroke the wisps of hair at his temple. He closed his eyes. I watched his face, tipped up to meet the sun. There was a delicacy to his features that sometimes made him look younger than he was. His lips were flushed and full. His eyes opened. Name one hero who was happy. I considered. Heracles went mad and killed his family. Theseus lost his bride and father. Jason's children and new wife were murdered by his old. Bellerophon killed the Chimera, but was crippled by the fall from Pegasus' back. You can't. He was sitting up now, leaning forward. I can't. I know. They never let you be famous and happy. He lifted an eyebrow. I'll tell you a secret. Tell me. I loved it when he was like this. I'm going to be the first. He took my palm and held it to his. Swear it. Why me? Because you're the reason. Swear it. I swear it, I said, lost in the high colour of his cheeks, the flame in his eyes. I swear it, he echoed. We sat like that a moment, hands touching. He grinned. I feel like I could eat the world raw. A trumpet blew, somewhere on the slopes beneath us. It was abrupt and ragged, as if it sounded in warning. Before I could speak or move, he was on his feet, his dagger out, slapped up from the sheath on his thigh. It was only a hunting knife, but in his hands it would be enough. He stood poised, utterly still, listening with all his half-god senses. I had a knife too. Quietly, I reached for it and stood. He had placed himself between me and the sound. I did not know if I should go to him, stand beside him with my own weapon lifted. In the end, I did not. It had been a soldier's trumpet, and battle, as Chiron had so bluntly said, was his gift, not mine. The trumpet sounded again. We heard the swish of underbrush, tangled by a pair of feet. One man. Perhaps he was lost, perhaps in danger. Achilles took a step towards the sound. As if in answer, the trumpet came again. Then a voice bawled up the mountain. Prince Achilles! We froze. Achilles! I'm here for Prince Achilles! Birds burst from the trees, fleeing the clamour. From your father, I whispered. Only a royal herald would have known where to call for us. Achilles nodded, but seemed strangely reluctant to answer. I imagined how hard his pulse would be beating. He had been prepared to kill a moment ago. We are here, I shouted into the cupped palms of my hand. The noise stopped for a moment. Where? Can you follow my voice? He could, though poorly. It was some time before he stepped forward into the clearing. His face was scratched, and he had sweated through his palace tunic. He knelt with ill grace, resentfully. Achilles had lowered the knife, though I saw how tightly he still held it. "Yes." His voice was cool. "Your father summons you. There is urgent business at home." I felt myself go still as Achilles had been a moment before. If I stayed still enough, perhaps we would not have to go. "What sort of business?" Achilles asked. The man had recovered himself somewhat. He remembered he was speaking to a prince. "My lord, your pardon. I do not know all of it. Messengers came to Peleus from Mycenae with news. Your father plans to speak tonight to the people, and wishes you to be there. I have horses for you below." There was a moment of silence. Almost, I thought Achilles would decline, but at last he said, "Patroclus and I will need to pack our things." On the way back to the cave and Chiron, Achilles and I speculated about the news. Mycenae was far to our south, and its king was Agamemnon, who liked to call himself a lord of men. He was said to have the greatest army of all our kingdoms. "Whatever it is, we'll only be gone for a night or two," Achilles told me. I nodded, grateful to hear him say it. Just a few days. Chiron was waiting for us. "I heard the shouts," the centaur said. Achilles and I, knowing him well, recognized the disapproval in his voice. He did not like the peace of his mountain disturbed. "My father has summoned me home," Achilles said. "Just for tonight. I expect I will be back soon." "I see," Chiron said. He seemed larger than usual, standing there, hooves dull against the bright grass, his chestnut-coloured flanks lit by the sun. I wondered if he would be lonely without us. I had never seen him with another centaur. We asked him about them once, and his face had gone stiff. "Barbarians," he'd said. We gathered our things. I had almost nothing to bring with me, some tunics, a flute. Achilles had only a few possessions more, his clothes, and some spearheads he had made, and the statue I had carved for him. We placed them in leather bags and went to say our farewells to Chiron. Achilles, always bolder, embraced the centaur, his arms encircling the place where the horse flank gave way to flesh. The messenger, waiting behind me, shifted. "Achilles," Chiron said, "do you remember when I asked you what you would do when men wanted you to fight?" "Yes," said Achilles. "You should consider your answer," Chiron said. A chill went through me, but I did not have time to think on it. Chiron was turning to me. "Patroclus," he said, a summons. I walked forward, and he placed his hand, large and warm as the sun, on my head. I breathed in the scent that was his alone, horse and sweat and herbs and forest. His voice was quiet. "You do not give things up so easily now as you once did," he said. I did not know what to say to this, so I said, "Thank you." A trace of smile. "Be well." Then his hand was gone, leaving my head chilled in its absence. "We will be back soon," Achilles said again. Chiron's eyes were dark in the slanting afternoon light. "I will look for you," he said. We shouldered our bags and left the cave's clearing. The sun was already past the meridian, and the messenger was impatient. We moved quickly down the hill and climbed on the horses that waited for us. The saddle felt strange after so many years on foot, and the horses unnerved me. I half expected them to speak, but of course they could not. I twisted in my seat to look back at Pelion. I hoped that I might be able to see the rose quartz cave, or maybe Chiron himself, but we were too far. I turned to face the road and allowed myself to be led to Thaya. Chapter 11. The last bit of sun was flaring on the western horizon as we passed the boundary stone that marked the palace grounds. We heard the cry go up from the guards and an answering trumpet. We crested the hill, and the palace lay before us. Behind it brooded the sea. And there, on the house's threshold, sudden as lightning strike, stood Thetis. Her hair shone black against the white marble of the palace. Her dress was dark, the colour of an uneasy ocean, bruising purples mixed with churning greys. Somewhere beside her there were guards, and Peleus too, but I did not look at them. I saw only her and the curved knife's blade of her jaw. "Your mother," I whispered to Achilles. I could have sworn her eyes flashed over me as if she had heard. I swallowed and forced myself onward. She will not hurt me. Chiron has said she will not. It was strange to see her among mortals. She made all of them, guards and Peleus alike, look bleached and wan, though it was her skin that was pale as bone. She stood well away from them, spearing the sky with her unnatural height. The guards lowered their eyes in fear and deference. Achilles swung down from his horse, and I followed. Thetis drew him into an embrace, and I saw the guards shifting their feet. They were wondering what her skin felt like. They were glad they did not know. "Son of my womb, flesh of my flesh, Achilles," she said. The words were not spoken loudly, but they carried through the courtyard. "Be welcome home." "Thank you, mother," Achilles said. He understood that she was claiming him. We all did. It was proper for a son to greet his father first. Mothers came second, if at all. But she was a goddess. Peleus's mouth had tightened, but he said nothing. When she released him, he went to his father. "Be welcome, son," Peleus said. His voice sounded weak after his goddess wife's, and he looked older than he had been. 3 years we had been away. "And be welcome also, Patroclus." Everyone turned to me, and I managed a bow. I was aware of Thetis's gaze, raking over me. It left my skin stinging, as if I had gone from the briar patch to the ocean. I was glad when Achilles spoke. "What is the news, father?" Peleus eyed the guards. Speculation and rumour must be racing down every corridor. "I have not announced it, and I do not mean to until everyone is gathered. We were waiting on you. Come, and let us begin." We followed him into the palace. I wanted to speak to Achilles, but did not dare to. Thetis walked right behind us. Servants skittered from her, huffing in surprise. The goddess. Her feet made no sound as they moved over the stone floors. The great dining hall was crammed full of tables and benches. Servants hurried by with platters of food or lugged mixing bowls brimming with wine. At the front of the room was a dais raised. This is where Peleus would sit, beside his son and wife. 3 places. My cheeks went red. What had I expected? Even amidst the noise of the preparations, Achilles' voice seemed loud. "Father, I do not see a place for Patroclus." My blush went even deeper. "Achilles," I began in a whisper, "it does not matter." I wanted to say, "I will sit with the men, it is all right," but he ignored me. "Patroclus is my sworn companion. His place is beside me." Thetis's eyes flickered. I could feel the heat in them. I saw the refusal on her lips. "Very well," Peleus said. He gestured to a servant, and a place was added for me, thankfully at the opposite side of the table from Thetis. Making myself as small as I could, I followed Achilles to our seats. "She'll hate me now," I said. "She already hates you," he answered with a flash of smile. This did not reassure me. "Why has she come?" I whispered. Only something truly important would have drawn her here from her caves in the sea. Her loathing for me was nothing to what I saw on her face when she looked at Peleus. He shook his head. "I do not know. It is strange. I have not seen them together since I was a boy." I remembered Chiron's parting words to Achilles. You should consider your answer. Chiron thinks the news will be war. Achilles frowned. But there is always war in Mycenae. I do not see why we should have been called. Peleus sat, and a herald blew 3 short blasts upon his trumpet, the signal for the meal to begin. Normally, it took several minutes for the men to gather, dawdling on the practice fields, drawing out the last bit of whatever they were doing. But this time, they came like a flood after the breaking of the winter's ice. Quickly, the room was swollen with them, jostling for seats and gossiping. I heard the edge in their voices, a rising excitement. No one bothered to snap at a servant or kick aside a begging dog. There was nothing on their minds but the man from Mycenae and the news he had brought. Thetis was seated also. There was no plate for her, no knife. The gods lived on ambrosia and nectar, on the savour of our burnt offerings, and the wine we poured over their altars. Strangely, she was not so visible here, so blazing as she had been outside. The bulky, ordinary furniture seemed to diminish her somehow. Peleus stood. The room quieted, out to the farthest benches. He lifted his cup. I have received word from Mycenae, from the sons of Atreus, Agamemnon and Menelaus. The final stirrings and murmurs ceased utterly. Even the servants stopped. I did not breathe. Beneath the table, Achilles pressed his leg to mine. There has been a crime. He paused again, as if he were weighing what he would say. The wife of Menelaus, Queen Helen, has been abducted from the palace in Sparta. Helen? The hushed whisper of men to their neighbours. Since her marriage, the tales of her beauty had grown still greater. Menelaus had built around her palace walls thick with double-layered rock. He had trained his soldiers for a decade to defend it. But, for all his care, she had been stolen. Who had done it? Menelaus welcomed an embassy sent from King Priam of Troy. At his head was Priam's son, the Prince Paris, and it is he who is responsible. He stole the queen of Sparta from her bedchamber while the king slept. A rumble of outrage. Only an Easterner would so dishonour the kindness of his host. Everyone knew how they dripped with perfume, were corrupt from soft living. A real hero would have taken her outright with the strength of his sword. Agamemnon and Mycenae appeal to the men of Hellas to sail to the kingdom of Priam for her rescue. Troy is rich and will be easily taken, they say. All who fight will come home wealthy and renowned. This was well worded. Wealth and reputation were the things our people had always killed for. They have asked me to send a delegation of men from Tyre, and I have agreed. He waited for the murmuring to settle before adding, though I will not take any man who does not wish to go, and I will not lead the army myself. Who will lead it? Someone shouted. That is not yet determined, Peleus said, but I saw his eyes flicker to his son. No, I thought. My hand tightened on the edge of the chair. Not yet. Across from me, Thetis's face was cool and still, her eyes distant. She knew this was coming, I realized. She wants him to go. Chiron and the Rose Cave seemed impossibly far away, a childish idol. I understood, suddenly, the weight of Chiron's words. War was what the world would say Achilles was born for, that his hands and swift feet were fashioned for this alone. The cracking of Troy's mighty walls. They would throw him among thousands of Trojan spears and watch with triumph as he stained his fair hands red. Peleus gestured to Phoenix, his oldest friend, at one of the first tables. Lord Phoenix will note the names of all who wish to fight. There was a movement at the benches as men started to rise, but Peleus held up his hand. There is more. He lifted a piece of linen, dark with dense markings. Before Helen's betrothal to King Menelaus, she had many suitors. It seems these suitors swore an oath to protect her, whosoever might win her hand. Agamemnon and Menelaus now charge these men to fulfill their oath and bring her back to her rightful husband. He handed the linen sheet to the herald. I stared. An oath. In my mind, the sudden image of a brazier and the spill of blood from a white goat, a rich hall filled with towering men. The herald lifted the list. The runes seemed to tilt, and my eyes would not focus. He began to read. Antenor, Eurypylus, Machaon. I recognized many of the names, we all did. They were the heroes and kings of our time. But they were more to me than that. I had seen them in a stone chamber heavy with fire smoke. Agamemnon, a memory of a thick black beard, a brooding man with narrowed, watchful eyes. Odysseus, the scar that wrapped his calf, pink as gums. Ajax, twice as large as any man in the room, with his huge shield behind him. Philoctetes, the bowman. Menoetiadas. The herald paused a moment, and I heard the murmur, Who? My father had not distinguished himself in the years since my exile. His fame had diminished, his name was forgotten, and those who did know him had never heard of a son. I sat frozen, afraid to move lest I give myself away. I am bound to this war. The herald cleared his throat. Idomeneus. Diomedes. Is that you? You were there. Achilles had turned back to face me. His voice was low, barely audible, but still I feared that someone might hear it. I nodded. My throat was too dry for words. I had thought only of Achilles' danger, of how I would try to keep him here, if I could. I had not even considered myself. Listen, it is not your name any more. Say nothing. We will think what to do. We will ask Chiron. Achilles never spoke like that, each word cutting off the next in haste. His urgency brought me back to myself a little, and I took heart from his eyes on mine. I nodded again. The names kept coming, and memories came with them. 3 women on a dais, and one of them Helen. A pile of treasure, and my father's frown. The stone beneath my knees. I had thought I dreamt it. I had not. When the herald had finished, Peleus dismissed the men. They stood as one, benches scraping, eager to get to Phoenix to enlist. Peleus turned to us. Come, I would speak further with you both. I looked to Thetis to see if she would come too, but she was gone. We sat by Peleus's fireside. He had offered us wine, barely watered. Achilles refused it. I took a cup, but did not drink. The king was in his old chair, the one closest to the fire, with its cushions and high back. His eyes rested on Achilles. I have called you home with the thought that you might wish to lead this army. It was spoken. The fire popped. Its wood was green. Achilles met his father's gaze. I have not finished yet with Chiron. You have stayed on Pelion longer than I did, than any hero before. That does not mean I must run to help the sons of Atreus every time they lose their wives. I thought Peleus might smile at that, but he did not. I do not doubt that Menelaus rages at the loss of his wife, but the messenger came from Agamemnon. He has watched Troy grow rich and ripe for years, and now thinks to pluck her. The taking of Troy is a feat worthy of our greatest heroes. There may be much honor to be won from sailing with him. Achilles' mouth tightened. there will be other wars. Peleus did not nod exactly, but I saw him register the truth of it. What of Patroclus, then? He is called to serve. He is no longer the son of Menoetius. He is not bound by the oath. Pious Peleus raised an eyebrow. There is some shuffling there. I do not think so. Achilles lifted his chin. The oath was undone when his father disowned him. I do not wish to go, I said softly. Peleus regarded us both for a moment. Then he said, Such a thing is not for me to decide. I will leave it to you. I felt the tension slide from me a little. He would not expose me. Achilles, men are coming here to speak with you. Kings sent by Agamemnon. Outside the window, I heard the ocean's steady whisper against the sand. I could smell the salt. They will ask me to fight, Achilles said. It was not a question. They will. You wish me to give them audience? I do. There was quiet again. Then Achilles said, I will not dishonor them, or you. I will hear their reasons, but I say to you that I do not think they will convince me. I saw that Peleus was surprised a little by his son's certainty, but not displeased. That is also not for me to decide, he said mildly. The fire popped again, spitting out its sap. Achilles knelt, and Peleus placed one hand on his head. I was used to seeing Chiron do this, and Peleus's hand looked withered by comparison, threaded with trembling veins. It was hard to remember sometimes that he had been a warrior, that he had walked with gods. Achilles' room was as we had left it, except for the cot, which had been removed in our absence. I was glad. It was an easy excuse, in case anyone asked why we shared a bed. We reached for each other, and I thought of how many nights I had lain awake in this room, loving him in silence. Later, Achilles pressed close for a final, drowsy whisper. If you have to go, you know I will go with you. We slept. Chapter 12. I woke to the red of my eyelids straining out the sun. I was cold, my right shoulder exposed to the breezes of the window, the one that faced the sea. The space beside me on the bed was empty, but the pillow still held the shape of him, and the sheets smelled of us both. I had spent so many mornings alone in this room, as he visited his mother. I did not think it was strange to find him gone. My eyes closed, and I sank again into the trailing thoughts of dreams. Time passed, and the sun came hot over the windowsill. The birds were up, and the servants, and even the men. I heard their voices from the beach and the practice hall, the rattle and bang of chores. I sat up. His sandals were overturned beside the bed, forgotten. It was not unusual. He went barefoot most places. He had gone to breakfast, I guessed. He was letting me sleep. Half of me wanted to stay in the room until his return, but that was cowardice. I had a right to a place by his side now, and I would not let the eyes of the servants drive me away. I pulled on my tunic and left to find him. He was not in the great hall, busy with servants removing the same platters and bowls there had always been. He was not in Peleus's council chamber, hung with purple tapestry and the weapons of former Thyian kings. And he was not in the room where we used to play the lyre. The trunk that had once kept our instruments sat forlorn in the room's centre. He was not outside either, in the trees he and I had climbed, or by the sea, on the jutting rocks where he waited for his mother, nor on the practice field where men sweated through drills, clacking their wooden swords. I do not need to say that my panic swelled, that it became a live thing, slippery and deaf to reason. My steps grew hurried. The kitchen, the basement, the storerooms with their amphorae of oil and wine. And still I did not find him. It was midday when I sought out Peleus's room. It was a sign of the size of my unease that I went at all. I had never spoken to the old man alone before. The guards outside stopped me when I tried to enter. The king was at rest, they said. He was alone and would see no one. "But is Achilles—" I gulped, trying not to make a spectacle of myself, to feed the curiosity I saw in their eyes. "Is the prince with him?" "He is alone," one of them repeated. I went to Phoenix next, the old counselor who had looked after Achilles when he was a boy. I was almost choking with fear as I walked to his stateroom, a modest square chamber at the palace's heart. He had clay tablets in front of him, and on them the men's marks from the night before, angular and crisscrossing, pledging their arms to the war against Troy. "The Prince Achilles," I said. I spoke haltingly, my voice thick with panic. "I cannot find him." He looked up with some surprise. He had not heard me come in the room. His hearing was poor, and his eyes, when they met mine, were rheumy and opaque with cataract. "Peleus did not tell you, then?" His voice was soft. "No." My tongue was like a stone in my mouth, so big I could barely speak around it. "I'm sorry," he said kindly. "His mother has him. She took him last night as he was sleeping. They are gone. No one knows where." Later, I would see the red marks where my nails had dug through my palms. No one knows where. To Olympus, perhaps, where I could never follow. To Africa or India, to some village where I would not think to look. Phoenix's gentle hands guided me back to my room. My mind twisted desperately from thought to thought. I would return to Chiron and seek counsel. I would walk the countryside, calling his name. She must have drugged him or tricked him. He would not have gone willingly. As I huddled in our empty room, I imagined it, the goddess leaning over us, cold and white beside the warmth of our sleeping bodies. Her fingernails prick into his skin as she lifts him. Her neck is silvery in the window's moonlight. His body lolls on her shoulder, sleeping or spelled. She carries him from me, as a soldier might carry a corpse. She is strong. It takes only one of her hands to keep him from falling. I did not wonder why she had taken him. I knew. She had wanted to separate us, the first chance she had, as soon as we were out of the mountains. I was angry at how foolish we had been. Of course she would do this. Why had I thought we would be safe? That Chiron's protection would extend here, where it never had before. She would take him to the caves of the sea and teach him contempt for mortals. She would feed him with the food of the gods and burn his human blood from his veins. She would shape him into a figure meant to be painted on vases, to be sung of in songs, to fight against Troy. I imagined him in black armor, a dark helmet that left him nothing but eyes, bronze greaves that covered his feet. He stands with a spear in each hand and does not know me. Time folded in on itself, closed over me, buried me. Outside my window, the moon moved through her shapes and came up full again. I slept little and ate less. Grief pinned me to the bed like an anchor. It was only my pricking memory of Chiron that finally drove me forth. You do not give up so easily as you once did. I went to Peleus. I knelt before him on a wool rug, woven bright with purple. He started to speak, but I was too quick for him. One of my hands went to clasp his knees. The other reached upwards to seize his chin with my hand. The pose of supplication. It was a gesture I had seen many times, but had never made myself. I was under his protection now. He was bound to treat me fairly, by the law of the gods. "Tell me where he is," I said. He did not move. I could hear the muffled batter of his heart against his chest. I had not realized how intimate supplication was, how closely we would be pressed. His ribs were sharp beneath my cheek. The skin of his legs was soft and thin with age. "I do not know," he said. and the words echoed down the chamber, stirring the guards. I felt their eyes on my back. Supplicants were rare in Thia. Peleus was too good a king for such desperate measures. I pulled at his chin, tugging his face to mine. He did not resist. "I do not believe you," I said. A moment passed. "Leave us," he said. The words were for the guards. They shuffled their feet, but obeyed. We were alone. He leaned forward, down to my ear. He whispered, "Skyros." A place, an island. Achilles. When I stood, my knees ached, as if I had been kneeling a long time. Perhaps I had. I do not know how many moments passed between us in that long hall of Thyan kings. Our eyes were level now, but he would not meet my gaze. He had answered me because he was a pious man, because I had asked him as a supplicant, because the gods demanded it. He would not have otherwise. There was a dullness in the air between us, and something heavy, like anger. "I will need money," I told him. I do not know where these words came from. I had never spoken so before, to anyone, but I had nothing left to lose. "Speak to Phoenix. He will give it to you." I nodded my head, barely. I should have done much more. I should have knelt again and thanked him, rubbed my forehead on his expensive rug. I didn't. Peleus moved to stare out the open window. The sea was hidden by the house's curve, but we could both hear it, the distant hiss of waves against sand. "You may go," he told me. He meant it to be cold, I think, and dismissive, a displeased king to his subject, but all I heard was his weariness. I nodded once more and left. The gold that Phoenix gave me would have carried me to Skyros and back twice over. The ship's captain stared when I handed it to him. I saw his eyes flicking over it, weighing its worth, counting what it could buy him. "You will take me?" My eagerness displeased him. He did not like to see desperation in those who sought passage. Haste and a free hand spoke of hidden crimes. But the gold was too much for him to object. He made a noise, grudging of acceptance, and sent me to my berth. I had never been at sea before, and was surprised at how slow it was. The boat was a big-bellied trader, making its lazy rounds of the islands, sharing the fleece, oil, and carved furniture of the mainland with the more isolated kingdoms. Every night we put in at a different port to refill our water pots and unload our stores. During the days I stood at the ship's prow, watching the waves fall away from our black tarred hull, waiting for the sight of land. At another time I would have been enchanted with it all. The names of the ship's parts, halyard, mast, stern, the colour of the water, the scrubbed clean smell of the winds. But I barely noticed these things. I thought only of the small island flung out somewhere in front of me, and the fair-haired boy I hoped I would find there. The bay of Skyros was so small that I did not see it until we had swung around the rocky island's southern rim and were almost upon it. Our ship narrowly squeezed between its extending arms, and the sailors leaned over the sides to watch the rocks slide by, holding their breath. Once we were inside, the water was utterly calm, and the men had to row us the rest of the way. The confines were difficult to maneuver. I did not envy the captain's voyage out. "We are here," he told me sullenly. I was already walking for the gangway. The cliff face rose sharply in front of me. There was a path of steps carved into the rock, coiling up to the palace, and I took them. At their top were scrubby trees and goats, and the palace, modest and dull, made half from stone and half from wood. If it had not been the only building in sight, I might not have known it for the king's home. I went to the door and entered. The hall was narrow and dim, the air dingy with the smell of old dinners. At the far end, 2 thrones sat empty. A few guards idled at tables, dicing. They looked up. "Well?" one asked me. I am here to see King Lycomedes, I said. I lifted my chin so they would know I was a man of some importance. I had worn the finest tunic I could find, one of Achilles. I'll go, another one said to his fellows. He dropped his dice with a clatter and slumped out of the hall. Pelias would never have allowed such disaffection. He kept his men well and expected much from them in return. Everything about the room seemed threadbare and grey. The man reappeared. Come, he said. I followed him, and my heart picked up. I had thought long about what I would say. I was ready. In here. He gestured to an open door, then turned to go back to his dice. I stepped through the doorway. Inside, seated before the wispy remains of a fire, sat a young woman. I am the Princess Deidamia, she announced. Her voice was bright and almost childishly loud, startling after the dullness of the hall. She had a tipped-up nose and a sharp face, like a fox. She was pretty, and she knew it. I summoned my manners and bowed. I am a stranger, come for a kindness from your father. Why not a kindness from me? She smiled, tilting her head. She was surprisingly small. I guessed she would barely be up to my chest if she stood. My father is old and ill. You may address your petition to me, and I will answer it. She affected a regal pose, carefully positioned so the window lit her from behind. I am looking for my friend. Oh? Her eyebrow lifted. And who is your friend? A young man, I said carefully. I see. We do have some of those here. Her tone was playful, full of itself. Her dark hair fell down her back in thick curls. She tossed her head a little, making it swing, and smiled at me again. Perhaps you'd like to start with telling me your name. Chironides, I said, son of Chiron. She wrinkled her nose at the name's strangeness. Chironides? And? I am seeking a friend of mine, who would have arrived here perhaps a month ago. He is from Tyre. Something flashed in her eyes, or maybe I imagined it did. And why do you seek him? She asked. I thought that her tone was not so light as it had been. I have a message for him. I wished very much that I had been led to the old and ill king rather than her. Her face was like quicksilver, always racing to something new. She unsettled me. A message? She smiled coyly, tapped her chin with a painted fingertip. A message for a friend. And why should I tell you if I know this young man or not? Because you are a powerful princess, and I am your humble suitor. I knelt. This pleased her. Well, perhaps I do know such a man, and perhaps I do not. I will have to think on it. You will stay for dinner and await my decision. If you are lucky, I may even dance for you with my women. She cocked her head suddenly. You have heard of Deidamia's women? I am sorry to say that I have not. She made a moue of displeasure. All the kings send their daughters here for fostering. Everyone knows that but you. I bowed my head sorrowfully. I have spent my time in the mountains and have not seen much of the world. She frowned a little, then flicked her hand at the door. Till dinner, Chironides. I spent the afternoon in the dusty courtyard grounds. The palace sat on the island's highest point, held up against the blue of the sky, and the view was pretty, despite the shabbiness. As I sat, I tried to remember all that I had heard of Lycomedes. He was known to be kind enough, but a weak king of limited resources. Euboea to the west and Ionia to the east had long eyed his lands. Soon enough one of them would bring war, despite the inhospitable shoreline. If they heard a woman ruled here, it would be all the sooner. When the sun had set, I returned to the hall. Torches had been lit, but they only seemed to increase the gloom. Deidamia, a gold circlet gleaming in her hair, led an old man into the room. He was hunched over, and so draped with furs that I could not tell where his body began. She settled him on a throne and gestured grandly to a servant. I stood back, among the guards and a few other men whose function was not immediately apparent. Counselors, cousins, they had the same worn appearance as everything else in the room. Only Deidamia seemed to escape it, with her blooming cheeks and glossy hair. A servant motioned to the cracked benches and tables, and I sat. The king and the princess did not join us. They remained on their thrones at the hall's other end. Food arrived, hearty enough, but my eyes kept returning to the front of the room. I could not tell if I should make myself known. Had she forgotten me? But then she stood and turned her face towards our tables. "Stranger from Pelion," she called, "you will never again be able to say that you have not heard of Deidamia's women." Another gesture with a braceleted hand. A group of women entered, perhaps 24, speaking softly to each other, their hair covered and bound back in cloth. They stood in the empty central area that I saw now as a dancing circle. A few men took out flutes and drums, one a lyre. Deidamia did not seem to expect a response from me, or even to care if I had heard. She stepped down from the throne's dais and went to the women, claiming one of the taller ones as a partner. The music began. The steps were intricate, and the girls moved through them featly. In spite of myself, I was impressed. Their dresses swirled, and jewelry swung around their wrists and ankles as they spun. They tossed their heads as they whirled, like high-spirited horses. Deidamia was the most beautiful, of course. With her golden crown and unbound hair, she drew the eye, flashing her wrists prettily in the air. Her face was flushed with pleasure, and as I watched her, I saw her brightness grow brighter still. She was beaming at her partner, almost flirting. Now she would duck her eyes at the woman, now step close as if to tease with her touch. Curious, I craned my head to see the woman she danced with, but the crowd of white dresses obscured her. The music trilled to an end, and the dancers finished. Deidamia led them forward in a line to receive our praise. Her partner stood beside her, head bowed. She curtsied with the rest and looked up. I made some sort of sound, the breath jumping in my throat. It was quiet, but it was enough. The girl's eyes flickered to me. Several things happened at once then. Achilles, for it was Achilles, dropped Deidamia's hand and flung himself joyously at me, knocking me backwards with the force of his embrace. Deidamia screamed, "Pyrrha!" and burst into tears. Lycomedes, who was not so far sunk into dotage as his daughter had led me to believe, stood. "Pyrrha? What is the meaning of this?" I barely heard. Achilles and I clutched each other, almost incoherent with relief. "My mother," he whispered. "My mother, she—" "Pyrrha!" Lycomedes' voice carried the length of the hall, rising over his daughter's noisy sobs. He was talking to Achilles, I realized. Pyrrha, fire hair. Achilles ignored him. Deidamia wailed louder. The king, showing a judiciousness that surprised me, threw his eye upon the rest of his court, women and men both. "Out!" he ordered. They obeyed reluctantly, trailing their glances behind them. "Now," Lycomedes came forward, and I saw his face for the first time. His skin was yellowed, and his greying beard looked like dirty fleece. Yet his eyes were sharp enough. "Who is this man, Pyrrha?" "No one." Deidamia had seized Achilles' arm, was tugging at it. At the same time, Achilles answered coolly, "My husband." I closed my mouth quickly so I did not gape like a fish. "He is not! That's not true!" Deidamia's voice rose high, startling the birds roosting in the rafters. A few feathers wafted down to the floor. She might have said more, but she was crying too hard to speak clearly. Lycomedes turned to me, as if for refuge, man to man. "Sir, is this true?" Achilles was squeezing my fingers. "Yes," I said. "No!" the princess shrieked. Achilles ignored her pulling at him and gracefully inclined his head at Lycomedes. My husband has come for me, and now I may leave your court. Thank you for your hospitality. Achilles curtsied. I noted with an idle, dazed part of my mind that he did it remarkably well. Lycomedes held up a hand to prevent us. We should consult your mother first. It was she who gave you to me to foster. Does she know of this husband? No, Deidamia said again. Daughter. This was Lycomedes, frowning in a way that was not unlike his daughter's habit. Stop this scene. Release Pyrrha. Her face was blotchy and swollen with tears, her chest heaving. No. She turned to Achilles. You are lying. You have betrayed me. Monster. Apathes. Heartless. Lycomedes froze. Achilles' fingers tightened on mine. In our language, words come in different genders. She had used the masculine form. What was that? Said Lycomedes slowly. Deidamia's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin in defiance, and her voice did not waver. He is a man, she said, and then, we are married. What? Lycomedes clutched his throat. I could not speak. Achilles' hand was the only thing that kept me to earth. Do not do this, Achilles said to her. Please. It seemed to enrage her. I will do it. She turned to her father. You are a fool. I am the only one who knew. I knew. She struck her chest in emphasis. And now I'll tell everyone. Achilles! She screamed as if she would force his name through the stout stone walls, up to the gods themselves. Achilles! Achilles! I'll tell everyone! You will not. The words were cold and knife-sharp. They parted the princess's shouts easily. I know that voice. I turned. Thetis stood in the doorway. Her face glowed, the white blue of the flame's centre. Her eyes were black, gashed into her skin, and she stood taller than I had ever seen her. Her hair was as sleek as it always was, and her dress as beautiful, but there was something about her that seemed wild, as if an invisible wind whipped around her. She looked like a fury, the demons that come for men's blood. I felt my scalp trying to climb off my head. Even Deidamia dropped into silence. We stood there a moment, facing her. Then Achilles reached up and tore the veil from his hair. He seized the neckline of his dress and ripped it down the front, exposing his chest beneath. The firelight played over his skin, warming it to gold. No more, mother, he said. Something rippled beneath her features, a spasm of sorts. I was half afraid she would strike him down, but she only watched him with those restless, black eyes. Achilles turned then to Lycomedes. My mother and I have deceived you, for which I offer my apologies. I am the Prince Achilles, son of Peleus. She did not wish me to go to war, and hid me here as one of your foster daughters. Lycomedes swallowed and did not speak. We will leave now, Achilles said gently. The words shook Deidamia from her trance. No, she said, voice rising again. You cannot. Your mother said the words over us, and we are married. You are my husband. Lycomedes' breath rasped loudly in the chamber. His eyes were for Thetis alone. Is this true? He asked. It is, the goddess answered. Something fell from a long height in my chest. Achilles turned to me as if he would speak, but his mother was faster. You are bound to us now, King Lycomedes. You will continue to shelter Achilles here. You will say nothing of who he is. In return, your daughter will one day be able to claim a famous husband. Her eyes went to a point above Deidamia's head, then back. She added, It is better than she would have done. Lycomedes rubbed at his neck as if he would smooth its wrinkles. I have no choice, he said, as you know. What if I will not be silent? Deidamia's colour was high. "You have ruined me, you and your son. I have lain with him, as you told me to, and my honour is gone. I will claim him now, before the court, as recompense." "I have lain with him."
"You are a foolish girl,"
Thetis said. Each word fell like an axe blade, sharp and severing.
"Poor and ordinary, an expedient only. You do not deserve my son. You will keep your peace, or I will keep it for you."
Deidamia stepped backwards, her eyes wide, her lips gone white. Her hands were trembling. She lifted one to her stomach and clutched the fabric of her dress there, as if to steady herself. Outside the palace, beyond the cliffs, we could hear huge waves breaking on the rocks, dashing the shoreline to pieces. "I am pregnant," the princess whispered. I was watching Achilles when she said it, and I saw the horror on his face. Lycomedes made a noise of pain. My chest felt hollowed and eggshell thin. Enough. Perhaps I said it, perhaps I only thought it. I let go of Achilles' hand and strode to the door. Thetis must have moved aside for me. I would have run into her if she had not. Alone, I stepped into the darkness. "Wait!" Achilles shouted. It took him longer to reach me than it should have, I noted with detachment. The dress must be tangling his legs. He caught up to me, seized my arm. "Let go," I said. "Please, wait. Please, let me explain. I did not want to do it. My mother." He was breathless, almost panting. I had never seen him so upset. "She led the girl to my room. She made me. I did not want to. My mother said. She said." He was stumbling over his words. "She said that if I did as she said, she would tell you where I was." What had Deidamia thought would happen, I wondered, when she had her women dance for me? Had she really thought I would not know him? I could recognize him by touch alone, by smell. I would know him blind, by the way his breaths came and his feet struck the earth. I would know him in death, at the end of the world. "Patroclus." He cupped my cheek with his hand. "Do you hear me? Please, say something." I could not stop imagining her skin beside his, her swelling breasts and curving hips. I remembered the long days I grieved for him, my hands empty and idle, plucking the air like birds peck at dry earth. "Patroclus, you did it for nothing." He flinched at the emptiness of my voice, but how else was I to sound? "What do you mean?" "Your mother did not tell me where you were. It was Peleus." His face had gone pale, bled dry. "She did not tell you?" "No. Did you truly expect she would?" My voice cut harder than I meant it to. "Yes," he whispered. There were 1,000 things I might have said, to reproach him for his naivety. He had always trusted too easily. He had had so little in his life to fear or suspect. In the days before our friendship, I had almost hated him for this, and some old spark of that flared in me, trying to relight. Anyone else would have known that Thetis acted for her own purposes only. How could he be so foolish? The angry words pricked in my mouth. But when I tried to speak them, I found I could not. His cheeks were flushed with shame, and the skin beneath his eyes was weary. His trust was a part of him, as much as his hands or his miraculous feet. Despite my hurt, I would not wish to see it gone, to see him as uneasy and fearful as the rest of us, for any price. He was watching me closely, reading my face over and over, like a priest searching the auguries for an answer. I could see the slight line in his forehead that meant utmost concentration. Something shifted in me then, like the frozen surface of the Apidanos in spring. I had seen the way he looked at Deidamia, or rather, the way he did not. It was the same way he had looked at the boys in Thia, blank and unseeing. He had never, not once, looked at me that way. "Forgive me," he said again. I did not want it. It was not you. I did not like it. Hearing it soothed the last of the jagged grief that had begun when Deidamia shouted his name. My throat was thick with the beginning of tears. There is nothing to forgive, I said. Later that evening we returned to the palace. The great hall was dark, its fire burned to embers. Achilles had repaired his dress as best he could, but it still gaped to the waist. He held it closed in case we met a lingering guard. The voice came from the shadows, startling us. You have returned. The moonlight did not quite reach the thrones, but we saw the outline of a man there, thick with furs. His voice seemed deeper than it had before, heavier. We have, Achilles said. I could hear the slight hesitation before he answered. He had not expected to face the king again so soon. Your mother is gone. I do not know where. The king paused, as if awaiting a response. Achilles said nothing. My daughter, your wife, is in her room crying. She hopes you will come to her. I felt the flinch of Achilles' guilt. His words came out stiffly. It was not a feeling he was used to. It is unfortunate that she hopes for this. It is indeed, Lycomedes said. We stood in silence a moment. Then Lycomedes drew a weary breath. I suppose that you want a room for your friend. If you do not mind, Achilles said carefully. Lycomedes let out a soft laugh. No, Prince Achilles, I do not mind. There was another silence. I heard the king lift a goblet, drink, replace it on the table. The child must have your name. You understand this? This is what he had waited in the dark to say, beneath his furs by the dying fire. I understand it, Achilles said quietly. And you swear it. There was a hair's breadth of a pause. I pitied the old king. I was glad when Achilles said, I swear it. The old man made a sound like a sigh, but his words when they came were formal. He was a king again. Good night to you both. We bowed and left him. In the bowels of the palace, Achilles found a guard to show us to the guest quarters. The voice he used was high and fluting, his girl's voice. I saw the guard's eyes flicker over him, lingering on the torn edges of the dress, his dishevelled hair. He grinned at me with all his teeth. Right away, mistress, he said. In the stories, the gods have the power to delay the moon's course if they wish, to spin a single night the length of many. Such was this night, a bounty of hours that never ran dry. We drank deeply, thirsty for all that we had missed in the weeks we were separated. It was not until the sky began to blanch at last to grey that I remembered what he had said to Lycomedes in the hall. It had been forgotten amidst Deidamia's pregnancy, his marriage, our reunion. Your mother was trying to hide you from the war? He nodded. She does not want me to go to Troy. Why? I had always thought she wanted him to fight. I don't know. She says I'm too young. Not yet, she says. And it was her idea. I gestured at the remnants of the dress. Of course, I wouldn't have done it myself. He made a face and yanked at his hair, hanging still in its womanly curls. An irritant, but not a crippling shame, as it would have been to another boy. He did not fear ridicule. He had never known it. Anyway, it is only until the army leaves. My mind struggled with this. So truly it was not because of me that she took you. Deidamia was because of you, I think. He stared at his hands a moment. But the rest was the war. Chapter 13. The next days passed quietly. We took meals in our room and spent long hours away from the palace, exploring the island, seeking what shade there was beneath the scruffy trees. We had to be careful. Achilles could not be seen moving too quickly, climbing too skillfully, holding a spear. But we were not followed, and there were many places where he could safely let his disguise drop. On the far side of the island, there was a deserted stretch of beach, rock-filled but twice the size of our running tracks. Achilles made a sound of delight when he saw it and tore off his dress. I watched him race across it, as swiftly as if the beach had been flat. "Count for me," he shouted over his shoulder. I did, tapping against the sand to keep the time. "How many?" he called from the beach's end. 13, I called back. "I'm just warming up," he said. The next time it was 11, the last time it was 9. He sat down next to me, barely winded, his cheeks flushed with joy. He had told me of his days as a woman, the long hours of enforced tedium, with only the dances for relief. Free now, he stretched his muscles like one of Pelion's mountain cats, luxuriant in his own strength. In the evenings, though, we had to return to the great hall. Reluctant, Achilles would put on his dress and smooth back his hair. Often he bound it up in cloth, as he had that first night. Golden hair was uncommon enough to be remarked upon by the sailors and merchants who passed through our harbour. If their tales found the ears of someone clever enough, I did not like to think of it. A table was set for us at the front of the hall near the thrones. We ate there, the 4 of us, Lycomedes, Deidamia, Achilles and I. Sometimes we were joined by a counsellor or two, sometimes not. These dinners were mostly silent. They were for form, to quell gossip and maintain the fiction of Achilles as my wife and the king's ward. Deidamia's eyes darted eagerly towards him, hoping he would look at her, but he never did. "Good evening," he would say in his proper girl's voice as we sat, but nothing more. His indifference was a palpable thing, and I saw her pretty face flinch through emotions of shame and hurt and anger. She kept looking to her father, as if she hoped he might intervene. But Lycomedes put bite after bite in his mouth and said nothing. Sometimes she saw me watching her. Her face would grow hard then, and her eyes would narrow. She put a hand on her belly possessively, as if to ward off some spell I might cast. Perhaps she thought I was mocking her, flourishing my triumph. Perhaps she thought I hated her. She did not know that I almost asked him 100 times to be a little kinder to her. You do not have to humiliate her so thoroughly, I thought. But it was not kindness he lacked, it was interest. His gaze passed over her, as if she were not there. Once she tried to speak to him, her voice trembling with hope. "Are you well, Pyrrha?" He continued eating in his elegant, swift bites. He and I had planned to take spears to the far side of the island after dinner and catch fish by moonlight. He was eager to be gone. I had to nudge him beneath the table. "What is it?" he asked me. "The princess wants to know if you are well." "Oh!" He glanced at her briefly, then back to me. "I am well," he said. As the days wore on, Achilles took to waking early so that he might practice with spears before the sun rose high. We had hidden weapons in a distant grove. He would exercise there before returning to womanhood in the palace. Sometimes he might visit his mother afterwards, sitting on one of Skyros' jagged rocks, dangling his feet into the sea. It was one of these mornings, when Achilles was gone, that there was a loud rap on my door. "Yes?" I called, but the guards were already stepping inside. They were more formal than I had ever seen them, carrying spears and standing at attention. It was strange to see them without their dice. "You're to come with us," one of them said. "Why?" I was barely out of bed and still bleary with sleep. "The princess ordered it." A guard took each of my arms and towed me to the door. When I stuttered a protest, the first guard leaned towards me, his eyes on mine. "It will be better if you go quietly." He drew his thumb over his spear point in theatrical menace. I did not really think they would hurt me. but neither did I want to be dragged through the halls of the palace. "All right," I said. The narrow corridors where they led me I had never visited before. They were the women's quarters, twisting off from the main rooms, a beehive of narrow cells where Deidamia's foster sisters slept and lived. I heard laughter from behind the doors, and the endless shush-shush of the shuttle. Achilles said that the sun did not come through the windows here, and there was no breeze. He had spent nearly 2 months in them. I could not imagine it. At last we came to a large door, cut from finer wood than the rest. The guard knocked on it, opened it, and pushed me through. I heard it close firmly behind me. Inside, Deidamia was seated primly on a leather-covered chair regarding me. There was a table beside her, and a small stool at her feet. Otherwise the room was empty. She must have planned this, I realized. She knew that Achilles was away. There was no place for me to sit, so I stood. The floor was cold stone and my feet were bare. There was a second, smaller door. It led to her bedroom, I guessed. She watched me looking, her eyes bright as a bird's. There was nothing clever to say, so I said something foolish. "You wanted to speak with me?" She sniffed a little with contempt. "Yes, Patroclus. I wanted to speak with you." I waited, but she said nothing more, only studied me, a finger tapping the arm of her chair. Her dress was looser than usual. She did not have it tied across the waist as she often did, to show her figure. Her hair was unbound and held back at the temples with carved ivory combs. She tilted her head and smiled at me. "You are not even handsome. That is the funny thing. You are quite ordinary." She had her father's way of pausing as if she expected a reply. I felt myself flushing. I must say something. I cleared my throat. She glared at me. "I have not given you leave to speak." She held my gaze a moment, as if to make sure that I would not disobey, then continued. "I think it's funny. Look at you." She rose, and her quick steps ate up the space between us. "Your neck is short. Your chest is thin as a boy's." She gestured at me with disdainful fingers. "And your face," she grimaced. "Hideous. My women quite agree. Even my father agrees." Her pretty red lips parted to show her white teeth. It was the closest I had ever been to her. I could smell something sweet, like a canthus flower. Close up, I could see that her hair was not just black, but shot through with shifting colours of rich brown. "Well, what do you say?" Her hands were on her hips. "You have not given me leave to speak," I said. Anger flashed over her face. "Don't be an idiot," she spat at me. I wasn't." She slapped me. Her hand was small but carried surprising force. It turned my head to the side roughly. The skin stung, and my lip throbbed sharply where she had caught it with a ring. I had not been struck like this since I was a child. Boys were not usually slapped, but her father might do it to show contempt. Mine had. It shocked me. I could not have spoken even if I had known what to say. She bared her teeth at me, as if daring me to strike her in return. When she saw I would not, her face twisted with triumph. "Coward! As craven as you are ugly. And half moron besides, I hear." "I do not understand it. It makes no sense that he should—" She stopped abruptly, and the corner of her mouth tugged down as if caught by a fisherman's hook. She turned her back to me and was silent. A moment passed. I could hear the sound of her breaths, drawn slowly, so I would not guess she was crying. I knew the trick. I had done it myself. "I hate you," she said. But her voice was thick, and there was no force in it. A sort of pity rose in me, cooling the heat of my cheeks. I remembered how hard a thing indifference was to bear. I heard her swallow, and her hand move swiftly to her face, as if to wipe away tears. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. That should make you happy. My father wants me to begin my confinement early. He says it would bring shame upon me for the pregnancy to be seen before it was known I was married. Confinement. I heard the bitterness in her voice when she said it. Some small house at the edge of Lycomedes' land. She would not be able to dance or speak with companions there. She would be alone with a servant and her growing belly. I'm sorry, I said. She did not answer. I watched the soft heaving of her back beneath the white gown. I took a step towards her, then stopped. I had thought to touch her, to smooth her hair in comfort, but it would not be comfort from me. My hand fell back to my side. We stood there like that for some time, the sound of our breaths filling the chamber. When she turned, her face was ruddy from crying. Achilles does not regard me. Her voice trembled a little. Even though I bear his child and am his wife. Do you know why this is so? It was a child's question, like why the rain falls or why the sea's motion never ceases. I felt older than her, though I was not. I do not know, I said softly. Her face twisted. That's a lie. You're the reason. You will sail with him, and I will be left here. I knew something of what it was to be alone, of how another's good fortune pricked like a goad. But there was nothing I could do. I should go, I said, as gently as I could. No! She moved quickly to block my way. Her words tumbled out. You cannot. I will call the guards if you try. I will say you attacked me. Sorrow for her dragged at me, bearing me down. Even if she called them, even if they believed her, they could not help her. I was the companion of Achilles, and invulnerable. My feelings must have shown on my face. She recoiled from me as if stung, and the heat sparked in her again. You were angry that he married me, that he lay with me. You were jealous. You should be. Her chin lifted, as it used to. It was not just once. It was twice. Achilles had told me. She thought that she had power to drive a wedge between us, but she had nothing. I'm sorry, I said again. I had nothing better to say. He did not love her. He never would. As if she heard my thought, her face crumpled. Her tears fell on the floor, turning the grey stone black, drop by drop. Let me get your father, I said, or one of your women. She looked up at me. Please, she whispered. Please do not leave. She was shivering like something just born. Always before, her hurts had been small, and there had been someone to offer her comfort. Now there was only this room, the bare walls and single chair, the closet of her grief. Almost unwillingly, I stepped towards her. She gave a small sigh, like a sleepy child, and drooped gratefully into the circle of my arms. Her tears bled through my tunic. I held the curves of her waist, felt the warm, soft skin of her arms. He had held her just like this, perhaps. But Achilles seemed a long way off. His brightness had no place in this dull, weary room. Her face, hot as if with fever, pressed against my chest. All I could see of her was the top of her head, the whirl and tangle of her shining dark hair, the pale scalp beneath. After a time, her sobs subsided, and she drew me closer. I felt her hands stroking my back, the length of her body pressing to mine. At first I did not understand. Then I did. You do not want this, I said. I made to step back, but she held me too tightly. I do. Her eyes had an intensity to them that almost frightened me. Deidamia. I tried to summon the voice I had used to make Peleus yield. The guards are outside. You must not. But she was calm now, and sure. They will not disturb us. I swallowed, my throat dry with panic. Achilles will be looking for me. She smiled sadly. He will not look here. She took my hand. Come, she said, and drew me through her bedroom's door. Achilles had told me about their nights together when I asked. It had not been awkward for him to do so. Nothing was forbidden between us. Her body, he said, was soft and small as a child's. She had come to his cell at night with his mother and lain beside him on the bed. He had feared he would hurt her. It had been swift, and neither spoke. He floundered as he tried to describe the heavy, thick smell, the wetness between her legs. Greasy, he said, like oil. When I pressed him further, he shook his head. I cannot remember, really. It was dark, and I could not see. I wanted it to be over. He stroked my cheek. I missed you. The door closed behind us, and we were alone in a modest room. The walls were hung with tapestries, and the floor was thick with sheepskin rugs. There was a bed, pushed against the window to catch the hint of breeze. She pulled her dress over her head and dropped it on the floor. Do you think I am beautiful? She asked me. I was grateful for a simple answer. Yes, I said. Her body was small and delicately made, with just the barest rise of belly where the child grew. My eyes were drawn down to what I had never seen before, a small furred area, the dark hairs spreading lightly upwards. She saw me looking. Reaching for my hand, she guided me to that place, which radiated heat like the embers of a fire. The skin that slipped against my fingers was warm and delicate, so fragile I was almost afraid I would tear it with my touch. My other hand reached up to stroke her cheek, to trace the softness beneath her eyes. The look in them was terrible to see. There was no hope or pleasure, only determination. Almost I fled, but I could not bear to see her face broken open with more sorrow, more disappointment, another boy who could not give her what she wanted. So I allowed her hands, fumbling a little, to draw me to the bed, to guide me between her thighs, where tender skin parted, weeping slow, warm drops. I felt resistance and would have drawn back, but she shook her head sharply. Her small face was tight with concentration, her jaw set as if against pain. It was a relief for us both when at last the skin eased, gave way, when I slipped into that sheathing warmth within her. I will not say I was not aroused. A slow, climbing tension moved through me. It was a strange, drowsy feeling, so different from my sharp, sure desires for Achilles. She seemed hurt by this, my heavy-lidded response. More indifference. And so I let myself move, made sounds of pleasure, pressed my chest against hers as if in passion, flattening her soft, small breasts beneath me. She was pleased then, suddenly fierce, pulling and pushing me harder and faster, her eyes lighting in triumph at the changes in my breath. And then, at the slow rising of tide inside me, her legs, light but firm, wrapped around my back, bucking me into her, drawing out the spasm of my pleasure. Afterwards, we lay breathless, side by side but not touching. Her face was shadowed and distant, her posture strangely stiff. My mind was still muddied from climax, but I reached to hold her. I could offer her this, at least. But she drew away from me and stood, her eyes wary. The skin beneath them was dark as bruises. She turned to dress, and her round heart-shaped buttocks stared at me like a reproach. I did not understand what she had wanted. I only knew I had not given it. I stood and pulled on my tunic. I would have touched her, stroked her face, but her eyes warned me away, sharp and full. She held open the door. Hopelessly, I stepped over the threshold. Wait. Her voice sounded raw. I turned. Tell him goodbye, she said, and then closed the door, dark and thick between us. When I found Achilles again, I pressed myself to him in relief at the joy between us, at being released from her sadness and hurt. Later, I almost convinced myself it had not happened, that it had been a vivid dream drawn from his descriptions and too much imagination. But that is not the truth. Chapter 14. Deidamia left the next morning, as she had said she would. "She is visiting an aunt," Lycomedes told the court at breakfast, his voice flat. If there were questions, no one dared to ask them. She would be gone until the child was born, and Achilles could be named as father. The weeks that passed now felt curiously suspended. Achilles and I spent as much time as possible away from the palace, and our joy, so explosive at our reunion, had been replaced with impatience. We wanted to leave, to return to our lives on Pelion or in Phthia. We felt furtive and guilty with the princess gone. The court's eyes on us had sharpened, grown uncomfortable. Lycomedes frowned whenever he saw us. And then there was the war. Even here in far-off forgotten Skyros, news came of it. Helen's former suitors had honoured their vow, and Agamemnon's army was rich with princely blood. It was said that he had done what no man before him could, united our fractious kingdoms with common cause. I remembered him, a grim-faced shadow, shaggy as a bear. To my 9-year-old self, his brother Menelaus had been much the more memorable of the two, with his red hair and merry voice. But Agamemnon was older, and his armies the larger. He would lead the expedition to Troy. It was morning, and late winter, though it did not seem it. So far south, the leaves did not fall and no frost pinched the morning air. We lingered in a rock cleft that looked over the span of horizon, watching idly for ships or the grey flash of dolphin back. We hurled pebbles from the cliff, leaning over to watch them skitter down the rock face. We were high enough that we could not hear the sound of them breaking on the rocks below. "I wish I had your mother's lyre," he said. Me too. But it was in Phthia, left behind with everything else. We were silent a moment, remembering the sweetness of its strings. He leaned forward. "What is that?" I squinted. The sun sat differently on the horizon now that it was winter, seeming to slant into my eyes from every angle. I cannot tell. I stared at the haze where the sea vanished into the sky. There was a distant smudge that might have been a ship or a trick of the sun on the water. "If it's a ship, there will be news," I said, with a familiar clutch in my stomach. Each time I feared word would come of a search for the last of Helen's suitors, the oath-breaker. I was young then. It did not occur to me that no leader would wish it known that some had not obeyed his summons. "It is a ship, for certain," Achilles said. The smudge was closer now. The ship must be moving very quickly. The bright colours of the sail resolved themselves moment by moment out of the sea's blue-grey. "Not a trader," Achilles commented. Trading ships used white sails only, practical and cheap. A man needed to be rich indeed to waste his dye on sailcloth. Agamemnon's messengers had crimson and purple sails, symbols stolen from Eastern royalty. This ship's sails were yellow, whirled with patterns of black. "Do you know the design?" I asked. Achilles shook his head. We watched the ship skirt the narrow mouth of Skyros's bay and beach itself on the sandy shore. A rough-cut stone anchor was heaved overboard, the gangway lowered. We were too far to see much of the men on its deck, beyond dark heads. We had stayed longer than we should have. Achilles stood and tucked his wind-loosened hair back beneath its kerchief. My hands busied themselves with the folds of his dress, settling them more gracefully across his shoulders, fastening the belts and laces. It was barely strange any more to see him in it. When we were finished, Achilles bent towards me for a kiss. His lips on mine were soft and stirred me, He caught the expression in my eyes and smiled. "Later," he promised me, then turned and went back down the path to the palace. He would go to the women's quarters and wait there, amidst the looms and the dresses, until the messenger was gone. The hairline cracks of a headache were beginning behind my eyes. I went to my bedroom, cool and dark, its shutters barring the midday sun, and slept. A knock woke me. A servant, perhaps, or Lycomedes. My eyes still closed, I called. "Come in." "It's rather too late for that," a voice answered. The tone was amused, dry as driftwood. I opened my eyes and sat up. A man stood inside the open door. He was sturdy and muscular, with a close-cropped philosopher's beard, dark brown tinged with faintest red. He smiled at me, and I saw the lines where other smiles had been. It was an easy motion for him, swift and practiced. Something about it tugged at my memory. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." His voice was pleasant, well modulated. "It's all right," I said carefully. "I was hoping I might have a word with you. Do you mind if I sit?" He gestured towards a chair with a wide palm. The request was politely made. Despite my unease, I could find no reason to refuse him. I nodded, and he drew the chair to him. His hands were calloused and rough. They would not have looked out of place holding a plough, yet his manner bespoke nobility. To stall, I stood and opened the shutters, hoping my brain would shake off its sleepy fog. I could think of no reason that any man would want a moment of my time, unless he had come to claim me for my oath. I turned to face him. "Who are you?" I asked. The man laughed. "Good question. I've been terribly rude, barging into your room like this. I am one of the great King Agamemnon's captains. I travel the islands and speak to promising young men such as yourself." He inclined his head towards me. "About joining our army against Troy. Have you heard of the war?" "I have heard of it," I said. "Good." He smiled and stretched his feet in front of him. The fading light fell on his legs, revealing a pink scar that seamed the brown flesh of his right calf from ankle to knee. A pink scar. My stomach dropped as if I leaned over Skyros's highest cliff, with nothing beneath me but the long fall to the sea. He was older now, and larger, come into the full flush of his strength. Odysseus. He said something, but I did not hear it. I was back in Tyndareus's hall, remembering his clever dark eyes that missed nothing. Did he know me? I stared at his face, but saw only a slightly puzzled expectation. He is waiting for an answer. I forced down my fear. "I'm sorry," I said. I did not hear you. What?" "Are you interested in joining us to fight?" "I don't think you'd want me. I'm not a very good soldier." His mouth twisted wryly. "It's funny. No one seems to be when I come calling." His tone was light. It was a shared joke, not a reproach. "What's your name?" I tried to sound as casual as he. "Chironides." "Chironides," he repeated. I watched him for disbelief, but saw none. The tension in my muscles ebbed a little. Of course he did not recognize me. I had changed much since I was 9. "Well, Chironides, Agamemnon promises gold and honor for all who fight for him. The campaign looks to be short. We will have you back home by next fall. I will be here for a few days, and I hope you will consider it." He dropped his hands to his knees with finality and stood. "That's it?" I had expected persuasion and pressure, a long evening of it. He laughed almost affectionately. "Yes, that's it. I assume I will see you at dinner." I nodded. He made as if to go, then stopped. "You know, it's funny. I keep thinking I've seen you before." "I doubt it," I said quickly. "I don't recognize you." He studied me a moment, then shrugged, giving up. I must be confusing you with another young man. You know what they say, the older you get, the less you remember. He scratched his beard thoughtfully. Who's your father? Perhaps it's him I know. I am an exile. He made a sympathetic face. I'm sorry to hear it. Where were you from? The coast. North or south? South. He shook his head ruefully. I would have sworn you were from the north. Somewhere near Thessaly, say. Or Thia. You have the same roundness to your vowels that they do. I swallowed. In Thia, the consonants were harder than elsewhere, and the vowels wider. It had sounded ugly to me, until I heard Achilles speak. I had not realized how much of it I had adopted. I did not know that, I mumbled. My heart was beating very fast. If only he would leave. Useless information is my curse, I'm afraid. He was amused again, that slight smile. Now don't forget to come find me if you decide you want to join us. Or if you happen to know of any other likely young men I should speak to. The door snicked shut behind him. The dinner bell had rung, and the corridors were busy with servants carrying platters and chairs. When I stepped into the hall, my visitor was already there, standing with Lycomedes and another man. Chironides? Lycomedes acknowledged my arrival. This is Odysseus, ruler of Ithaca. Thank goodness for hosts, Odysseus said. I realized after I left that I never told you my name. And I did not ask because I knew. It had been a mistake, but was not irreparable. I widened my eyes. You're a king. I dropped to a knee in my best startled obeisance. Actually, he's only a prince, a voice drawled. I'm the one who's a king. I looked up to meet the third man's eyes. They were a brown so light it was almost yellow and keen. His beard was short and black, and it emphasized the slanting planes of his face. This is Lord Diomedes, king of Argos, Lycomedes said, a comrade of Odysseus, and another suitor of Helen's, though I remembered no more than his name. Lord? I bowed to him. I did not have time to fear recognition. He had already turned away. Well, Lycomedes gestured to the table. Shall we eat? For dinner, we were joined by several of Lycomedes' counsellors, and I was glad to vanish among them. Odysseus and Diomedes largely ignored us, absorbed in talk with the king. And how is Ithaca? Lycomedes asked politely. Ithaca as well, thank you, Odysseus answered. I left my wife and son there, both in good health. Ask him about his wife, Diomedes said. He loves to talk about her. Have you heard how he met her? It's his favourite story. There was a goading edge to his voice, barely sheathed. The men around me stopped eating to watch. Lycomedes looked between the two men, then ventured. And how did you meet your wife, Prince of Ithaca? If Odysseus felt the tension, he did not show it. You are kind to ask. When Tyndareus sought a husband for Helen, suitors came from every kingdom, I'm sure you remember. I was married already, Lycomedes said. I did not go. Of course. And these were too young, I'm afraid. He tossed a smile at me, then turned back to the king. Of all these men, I was fortunate to arrive first. The king invited me to dine with the family. Helen, her sister Clytemnestra, and their cousin Penelope. Invited? Diomedes scoffed. Is that what they call crawling through the bracken to spy upon them? I'm sure the Prince of Ithaca would not do such a thing, Lycomedes frowned. Unfortunately, I did just that, though I appreciate your faith in me. He offered Lycomedes a genial smile. It was Penelope who caught me, actually. Said she had been watching me for over an hour and thought she should step in before I hit the thorn bush. Naturally, there was some awkwardness about it, but Tyndareus eventually came around and asked me to stay. In the course of dinner, I came to see that Penelope was twice as clever as her cousins and just as beautiful.
So, as beautiful as Helen?
Diomedes interrupted.
Is that why she was 20 and unmarried?
Odysseus's voice was mild. I'm sure you would not ask a man to compare his wife unfavorably to another woman, he said. Diomedes rolled his eyes and settled back to pick his teeth with the point of his knife. Odysseus returned to Lycomedes. So, in the course of our conversation, when it became clear that the Lady Penelope favored me—
Not for your looks, certainly,
Diomedes commented. Certainly not, Odysseus agreed. She asked me what wedding present I would make to my bride. A wedding bed, I said, rather gallantly, of finest home oak. But this answer did not please her. A wedding bed should not be made of dead dry wood, but something green and living, she told me. And what if I can make such a bed, I said. Will you have me? And she said— The king of Argos made a noise of disgust.
I'm sick to death of this tale about your marriage bed.
Then perhaps you shouldn't have suggested I tell it.
And perhaps you should get some new stories so I don't fucking kill myself of boredom.
Lycomedes looked shocked. Obscenity was for back rooms and practice fields, not state dinners. But Odysseus only shook his head sadly. Truly, the men of Argos get more and more barbaric with each passing year. Lycomedes, let us show the king of Argos a bit of civilization. I was hoping for a glimpse of the famous dancers of your isle. Lycomedes swallowed. Yes, he said. I had not thought— He stopped himself, then began again with the most kingly voice he could summon. If you wish.
We do.
This was Diomedes. Well, Lycomedes' eyes darted between the two men. Thetis had ordered him to keep the women away from visitors, but to refuse would be suspicious. He cleared his throat, decided, Well, let us call them then. He gestured sharply at a servant, who turned and ran from the hall. I kept my eyes on my plate, so they would not see the fear in my face. The women had been surprised by the summons and were still making small adjustments of clothes and hair as they entered the hall. Achilles was among them, his head carefully covered, his gaze modestly down. My eyes went anxiously to Odysseus and Diomedes, but neither even glanced at him. The girls took their places, and the music was struck. We watched as they began the complicated series of steps. It was beautiful, though lessened by Deidamia's absence. She had been the best of them.
Which one is your daughter?
Diomedes asked.
She is not here, King of Argos. She is visiting family.
Too bad, Diomedes said.
I hoped it was that one.
He pointed to a girl on the end, small and dark. She did look something like Deidamia, and her ankles were particularly lovely, flashing beneath the whirling hem of her dress. Lycomedes cleared his throat.
Are you married, my lord?
Diomedes half smiled.
For now.
His eyes never left the women. When the dance had finished, Odysseus stood, his voice raised for all to hear.
We are truly honored by your performance. Not everyone can say that they have seen the dances of Skyros. As tokens of our admiration, we have brought gifts for you and your king.
A murmur of excitement. Luxuries did not come often to Skyros. No one here had the money to buy them.
You are too kind.
Lycomedes' face was flushed with genuine pleasure. He had not expected this generosity. The servants brought trunks forth at Odysseus's signal and began unloading them on the long tables. I saw the glitter of silver, the shine of glass and gems. All of us, men and women both, leaned towards them, eager to see.
Please, take what you would like,
Odysseus said. The girls moved swiftly to the tables, and I watched them fingering the bright trinkets. Perfumes in delicate glass bottles stoppered with a bit of wax. Mirrors with carved ivory for handles. Bracelets of twisted gold. Ribbons dyed deep in purples and reds. Among these were a few things I assumed were meant for Lycomedes and his counselors. leather-bound shields, carved spear hafts, and silvered swords with supple kidskin sheaths. Lycomedes' eyes had caught on one of these, like a fish snagged by a line. Odysseus stood near, presiding benevolently. Achilles kept to the back, drifting slowly along the tables. He paused to dab some perfume on his slender wrists, stroke the smooth handle of a mirror. He lingered a moment over a pair of earrings, blue stones set in silver wire. A movement at the far end of the hall caught my eye. Diomedes had crossed the chamber and was speaking with one of his servants, who nodded and left through the large double doors. Whatever it was could not be important. Diomedes seemed half asleep, his eyes heavy-lidded and bored. I looked back to Achilles. He was holding the earrings up to his ears now, turning them this way and that, pursing his lips, playing at girlishness. It amused him, and the corner of his mouth curved up. His eyes flicked around the hall, catching for a moment on my face. I could not help myself. I smiled. A trumpet blew, loud and panicked. It came from outside, a sustained note, followed by 3 short blasts. Our signal for utmost impending disaster. Lycomedes lurched to his feet, the guards' heads jerked towards the door. Girls screamed and clung to each other, dropping their treasures to the ground in tinkles of breaking glass. All the girls but one. Before the final blast was finished, Achilles had swept up one of the silvered swords and flung off its kidskin sheath. The table blocked his path to the door. He leapt it in a blur, his other hand grabbing a spear from it as he passed. He landed, and the weapons were already lifted, held with a deadly poise that was like no girl, nor no man either. The greatest warrior of his generation. I yanked my gaze to Odysseus and Diomedes, and was horrified to see them smiling. "Greetings, Prince Achilles," Odysseus said. "We've been looking for you." I stood helpless, as the faces of Lycomedes' court registered Odysseus's words, turned towards Achilles, stared. For a moment Achilles did not move. Then slowly he lowered the weapons. "Lord Odysseus," he said. His voice was remarkably calm. "Lord Diomedes?" He inclined his head politely, one prince to another. "I am honoured to be the subject of so much effort." It was a good answer, full of dignity and the slightest twist of mockery. It would be harder for them to humiliate him now. "I assume you wish to speak with me. Just a moment and I will join you." He placed the sword and spear carefully on the table. With steady fingers he untied the kerchief, drew it off. His hair, revealed, gleamed like polished bronze. The men and women of Lycomedes' court whispered to one another in muted scandal. Their eyes clung to his figure. "Perhaps this will help." Odysseus had claimed a tunic from some bag or box. He tossed it to Achilles, who caught it. "Thank you," Achilles said. The court watched, hypnotized as he unfolded it, stripped to the waist, and drew it over himself. Odysseus turned to the front of the room. "Lycomedes, may we borrow a room of state, please? We have much to discuss with the Prince of Phthia." Lycomedes' face was a frozen mask. I knew he was thinking of Thetis and punishment. He did not answer. "Lycomedes!" Diomedes' voice was sharp, cracking like a blow. "Yes," Lycomedes croaked. I pitied him. I pitied all of us. "Yes, just through there." He pointed. Odysseus nodded. "Thank you." He moved towards the door, confidently, as if never doubting but that Achilles would follow. "After you," Diomedes smirked. Achilles hesitated, and his eyes went to me, just the barest glance. "Oh yes," Odysseus called over his shoulder. "You're welcome to bring Patroclus along, if you like. We have business with him as well." Chapter 15. The room had a few threadbare tapestries and 4 chairs. I forced myself to sit straight against the stiff wood back, as a prince should. Achilles' face was tight with emotion, and his neck flushed.
"It was a trick," he accused.
Odysseus was unperturbed.
"You were clever in hiding yourself. We had to be cleverer still in finding you."
Achilles lifted an eyebrow in princely hauteur.
"Well, you found me. What do you want?"
"We want you to come to Troy," Odysseus said.
"And if I do not want to come?"
"Then we make this known." Diomedes lifted Achilles' discarded dress. Achilles flushed as if he'd been struck. It was one thing to wear a dress out of necessity, another thing for the world to know of it. Our people reserved their ugliest names for men who acted like women. Lives were lost over such insults. Odysseus held up a restraining hand.
"We are all noble men here, and it should not have to come to such measures. I hope we can offer you happier reasons to agree. Fame, for instance. You will win much of it if you fight for us. There will be other wars."
"Not like this one," said Diomedes. "This will be the greatest war of our people, remembered in legend and song for generations. You are a fool not to see it."
"I see nothing but a cuckolded husband and Agamemnon's greed."
"Then you are blind. What is more heroic than to fight for the honor of the most beautiful woman in the world against the mightiest city of the East? Perseus cannot say he did so much, nor Jason. Heracles would kill his wife again for a chance to come along. We will master Anatolia all the way to Araby. We will carve ourselves into stories for ages to come." "I thought you said it would be an easy campaign, home by next fall," I managed. I had to do something to stop the relentless roll of their words.
"I lied."
Odysseus shrugged.
"I have no idea how long it will be. Faster if we have you."
He looked at Achilles. His dark eyes pulled like the tide, however you swam against it.
"The sons of Troy are known for their skill in battle, and their deaths will lift your name to the stars. If you miss it, you will miss your chance at immortality. You will stay behind, unknown. You will grow old, and older in obscurity."
Achilles frowned.
"You cannot know that."
"Actually, I can." He leaned back in his chair.
"I am fortunate to have some knowledge of the gods."
He smiled, as if at a memory of some divine mischief.
"And the gods have seen fit to share with me a prophecy about you."
I should have known that Odysseus would not come with tawdry blackmail as his only coin. The stories named him Polytropos, the man of many turnings. Fear stirred in me like ash.
"What prophecy?"
Achilles asked slowly.
"That if you do not come to Troy, your godhead will wither in you unused. Your strength will diminish. At best, you will be like Lycomedes here, mouldering on a forgotten island with only daughters to succeed him. Skyros will be conquered soon by a nearby state. You know this as well as I. They will not kill him. Why should they? He can live out his years in some corner eating the bread they soften for him, senile and alone. When he dies, people will say, 'Who?' The words filled the room, thinning the air until we could not breathe. Such a life was a horror. But Odysseus's voice was relentless. He is known now only because of how his story touches yours. If you go to Troy, your fame will be so great that a man will be written into eternal legend just for having passed a cup to you. You will be—" The doors blew open in a fury of flying splinters. Thetis stood in the doorway, hot as living flame. Her divinity swept over us all, singeing our eyes, blackening the broken edges of the door. I could feel it pulling at my bones, sucking at the blood in my veins as if it would drink me. I cowered, as men were made to do. Odysseus's dark beard was dusted with fine debris from the door's ruin. He stood. "Greetings, Thetis." Her gaze went to him as a snake's to her prey, and her skin glowed. The air around Odysseus seemed to tremble slightly, as if with heat or a breeze. Diomedes, on the ground, edged away. I closed my eyes so I would not have to see the explosion.
A silence into which at last I opened my eyes. Odysseus stood unharmed. Thetis's fists were strangling themselves white. It no longer burned to look at her. "The grey-eyed maiden has ever been kind to me," Odysseus said, almost apologetically. "She knows why I am here. She blesses and guards my purpose." It was as if I had missed a step of their conversation. I struggled now to follow the grey-eyed maiden, goddess of war and its arts. She was said to prize cleverness above all.
Athena has no child to lose.
The words grated from Thetis's throat, hung in the air. Odysseus did not try to answer, only turned to Achilles. "Ask her," he said. "Ask your mother what she knows." Achilles swallowed, loud in the silent chamber. He met his mother's black eyes. "Is it true? What he says?" The last of her fire was gone, only marble remained.
"It is true, but there is more, and worse that he has not said."
The words came tonelessly, as a statue would speak them.
"If you go to Troy, you will never return. You will die a young man there."
Achilles' face went pale. "Is it certain?" This is what all mortals ask first in disbelief, shock, fear. Is there no exception for me?
"It is certain."
If he had looked at me then, I would have broken. I would have begun to weep and never stopped. But his eyes were fixed on his mother. "What should I do?" he whispered. The slightest tremor over the still water of her face.
"Do not ask me to choose,"
she said, and vanished. I cannot remember what we said to the two men, how we left them, or how we came to our room. I remember his face, skin drawn tightly over his cheeks, the dulled pallor of his brow. His shoulders, usually so straight and fine, seemed fallen. Grief swelled inside me, choking me. His death. I felt as if I was dying just to think of it, plummeting through a blind black sky. "You must not go." I almost said it 1,000 times. Instead, I held his hands fast between mine. They were cold and very still. "I do not think I could bear it," he said at last. His eyes were closed as if against horrors. I knew he spoke not of his death, but of the nightmare Odysseus had spun, the loss of his brilliance, the withering of his grace. I had seen the joy he took in his own skill, the roaring vitality that was always just beneath the surface. Who was he, if not miraculous and radiant? Who was he, if not destined for fame? "I would not care," I said. The words scrabbled from my mouth. "Whatever you became, it would not matter to me. We would be together." "I know," he said quietly, but did not look at me. He knew, but it was not enough. The sorrow was so large, it threatened to tear through my skin. When he died, all things swift and beautiful and bright would be buried with him. I opened my mouth, but it was too late. "I will go," he said. "I will go to Troy." The rosy gleam of his lip, the fevered green of his eyes. There was not a line anywhere on his face, nothing creased or greying, all crisp. He was spring, golden and bright. Envious death would drink his blood and grow young again. He was watching me, his eyes as deep as earth. "Will you come with me?" he asked. The never-ending ache of love and sorrow. Perhaps in some other life I could have refused, could have torn my hair and screamed and made him face his choice alone. But not in this one. He would sail to Troy, and I would follow, even into death. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes." Relief broke in his face, and he reached for me. I let him hold me, let him press us length to length, so close that nothing might fit between us. Tears came and fell, Above us, the constellations spun and the moon paced her weary course. We lay stricken and sleepless as the hours passed. When dawn came, he rose stiffly. "I must go tell my mother," he said. He was pale and his eyes were shadowed. He looked older already. Panic rose in me. "Don't go," I wanted to say, but he drew on a tunic and was gone. I lay back and tried not to think of the minutes passing. Just yesterday we had had a wealth of them. Now each was a drop of heart's blood lost. The room turned grey, then white. The bed felt cold without him, and too large. I heard no sounds, and the stillness frightened me. It is like a tomb. I rose and rubbed my limbs, slapped them awake, trying to ward off a rising hysteria. This is what it will be every day without him. I felt a wild-eyed tightness in my chest, like a scream, every day without him. I left the palace, desperate to shut out thought. I came to the cliffs, Skyros' great rocks that beetled over the sea, and began to climb. The winds tugged at me, and the stones were slimy with spray, but the strain and danger steadied me. I arrowed upwards, towards the most treacherous peak, where before I would have been too fearful to go. My hands were cut almost to blood by jagged shards of rock. My feet left stains where they stepped. The pain was welcome, ordinary and clean. So easy to bear it was laughable. I reached the summit, a careless heap of boulders at the cliff's edge, and stood. An idea had come to me as I climbed, fierce and reckless as I felt. "Thetis!" I screamed it into the snatching wind, my face towards the sea. "Thetis!" The sun was high now. Their meeting had ended long ago. I drew a third breath.
"Do not speak my name again."
I whirled to face her and lost my balance. The rocks jumbled under my feet, and the wind tore at me. I grabbed at an outcrop, steadied myself. I looked up. Her skin was paler even than usual, the first winter's ice. Her lips were drawn back to show her teeth.
"You are a fool," she said. "Get down. Your half-wit death will not save him."
I was not so fearless as I thought. I flinched from the malice in her face, but I forced myself to speak, to ask the thing I had to know of her. How much longer will he live? She made a noise in her throat, like the bark of a seal. It took me a moment to understand that it was laughter.
"Why? Would you prepare yourself for it? Try to stop it."
Contempt spilled across her face. "Yes," I answered, "if I can." The sound again. "Please," I knelt. "Please tell me." Perhaps it was because I knelt. The sound ceased, and she considered me a moment.
"Hector's death will be first,"
she said.
"This is all I am given to know."
"Hector. Thank you," I said. Her eyes narrowed and her voice hissed like water poured on coals.
"Do not presume to thank me. I have come for another reason."
I waited. Her face was white as splintered bone.
"It will not be so easy as he thinks. The fates promise fame, but how much? He will need to guard his honor carefully. He is too trusting. The men of Greece," she spat the words, "are dogs over a bone. They will not simply give up preeminence to another. I will do what I can. And you—"
her eyes flickered over my long arms and skinny knees.
"You will not disgrace him. Do you understand?"
Do you understand? Yes, I said, and I did. His fame must be worth the life he paid for it. The faintest breath of air touched her dress's hem, and I knew she was about to leave, to vanish back to the caves of the sea. Something made me bold. "Is Hector a skilled soldier?"
"He is the best," she answered. "But for my son—"
Her gaze flickered to the right where the cliff dropped away.
"He is coming," she said.
Achilles crested the rise and came to where I sat. He looked at my face and my bloodied skin. "I heard you talking," he said. "It was your mother," I said. He knelt and took my foot in his lap. Gently, he picked the fragments of rock from the wounds, brushing off dirt and chalky dust. He tore a strip from his tunic's hem and pressed it tight to stanch the blood. My hand closed over his. "You must not kill Hector," I said. He looked up, his beautiful face framed by the gold of his hair. "My mother told you the rest of the prophecy." "She did." "And you think that no one but me can kill Hector?" "Yes," I said. "And you think to steal time from the fates?" "Yes." "Ah." A sly smile spread across his face. He had always loved defiance. "Well, why should I kill him? He's done nothing to me." For the first time then, I felt a kind of hope. We left that afternoon. There was no reason to linger. Ever dutiful to custom, Lycomedes came to bid us farewell. The three of us stood together stiffly. Odysseus and Diomedes had gone ahead to the ship. They would escort us back to Phthia, where Achilles would muster his own troops. There was one more thing to be done here, and I knew Achilles did not wish to do it. "Lycomedes, my mother has asked me to convey her desires to you." The faintest tremor crossed the old man's face, but he met his son-in-law's gaze. "It is about the child," he said. "It is." "And what does she wish?" the king asked wearily. "She wishes to raise him herself. She—" Achilles faltered before the look on the old man's face. "The child will be a boy," she says. "When he is weaned, she will claim him." Silence. Then Lycomedes closed his eyes. I knew he was thinking of his daughter, arms empty of both husband and child. "I wish you had never come," he said. "I'm sorry," Achilles said. "Leave me," the old king whispered. We obeyed. The ship we sailed on was Yar, tightly made and well manned. The crew moved with a competent fleetness, the ropes gleamed with new fibres, and the masts seemed fresh as living trees. The prow-piece was a beauty, the finest I had ever seen, a woman, tall with dark hair and eyes, her hands clasped in front of her as if in contemplation. She was beautiful, but quietly so, an elegant jaw, an upswept hair showing a slender neck. She had been lovingly painted, each darkness or lightness perfectly rendered. "You are admiring my wife, I see." Odysseus joined us at the railing, leaning on muscular forearms. "She refused at first, wouldn't let the artist near her. I had to have him follow her in secret. I think it turned out rather well, actually." A marriage for love, rare as cedars from the east. It almost made me want to like him, but I had seen his smiles too often now. Politely, Achilles asked, "What is her name?" "Penelope," he said. "Is the ship new?" I asked. If he wanted to speak of his wife, I wanted to speak of something else. "Very. Every last timber of it, from the best wood that Ithaca has." He slapped the railing with his large palm as one might the flank of a horse. "Bragging about your new ship again." Diomedes had joined us. His hair was lashed back with a strip of leather, and it made his face look sharper even than usual. "I am." Diomedes spat into the water. "The king of Argos is unusually eloquent today," Odysseus commented. Achilles had not seen their game before as I had. His eyes went back and forth between the two men. A small smile curled at the corner of his mouth. "Tell me," Odysseus continued, "do you think such quick wit comes from your father having eaten that man's brains?" "What?" Achilles' mouth hung open. "Oh, you don't know the tale of mighty Tydeus, king of Argos, eater of brains?" "I've heard of him, but not about the brains."
I was thinking of having the scene painted on our plates, Diomedes said. In the hall, I had taken Diomedes for Odysseus's dog, but there was a keenness that hummed between the two men, a pleasure in their sparring that could come only from equals. I remembered that Diomedes was rumoured to be a favourite of Athena as well. Odysseus made a face. Remind me not to dine in Argos any time soon. Diomedes laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. The kings were inclined to talk and lingered by the rail with us. They passed stories back and forth of other sea voyages, of wars, of contests won in games long past. Achilles was an eager audience, with question after question. Where did you get this? He was pointing to the scar on Odysseus's leg. Ah. Odysseus rubbed his hands together. That is a tale worth telling. Though I should speak to the captain first. He gestured to the sun, hanging ripe and low over the horizon. We'll need to stop soon for camp. I'll go. Diomedes stood from where he leaned against the rail. I've heard this one almost as many times as that sickening bed story. Your loss, Odysseus called after him. Don't mind him. His wife's a hellhound bitch, and that would sour anyone's temper. Now, my wife. I swear, Diomedes' voice carried back up the length of the ship. If you finish that sentence, I will throw you over the side and you can swim to Troy. See? Odysseus shook his head. Sour. Achilles laughed, delighted by them both. He seemed to have forgiven their part in his unmasking, and all that came after. Now, what was I saying? The scar, Achilles said eagerly. Yes, the scar. When I was 13. I watched him hang on the other man's words. He is too trusting. But I would not be the raven on his shoulder all the time, predicting gloom. The sun slid lower in the sky, and we drew close to the dark shadow of land where we would make camp. The ship found the harbour, and the sailors drew her up on the shore for the night. Supplies were unloaded, food and bedding and tents for the princes. We stood by the campsite that had been laid for us, a small fire and pavilion. Is all well here? Odysseus had come to stand with us. Very well, Achilles said. He smiled, his easy smile, his honest one. Thank you. Odysseus smiled in return, teeth white against his dark beard. Excellent. One tent's enough, I hope. I've heard that you prefer to share. Rooms and bedrolls both, they say. Heat and shock rushed through my face. Beside me, I heard Achilles' breath stop. Come now, there's no need for shame. It's a common enough thing among boys. He scratched his jaw, contemplated. Though you're not really boys any longer. How old are you? It's not true, I said. The blood in my face fired my voice. It rang loudly down the beach. Odysseus raised an eyebrow. True is what men believe, and they believe this of you. But perhaps they are mistaken. If the rumour concerns you, then leave it behind when you sail to war. Achilles' voice was tight and angry. It is no business of yours, Prince of Ithaca. Odysseus held up his hands. My apologies if I have offended. I merely came to wish you both good night, and ensure that all was satisfactory. Prince Achilles? Patroclus? He inclined his head and turned back to his own tent. Inside the tent there was quietness between us. I had wondered when this would come. As Odysseus said, many boys took each other for lovers, but such things were given up as they grew older, unless it was with slaves or hired boys. Our men liked conquest. They did not trust a man who was conquered himself. Do not disgrace him, the goddess had said, and this is some of what she had meant. Perhaps he is right, I said. Achilles' head came up, frowning. You do not think that? I do not mean. I twisted my fingers. I would still be with you, but I could sleep outside, so it would not be so obvious. I do not need to attend your councils. No. The Thyians will not care, and the others can talk all they like. I will still be Aristosarchion. Best of the Greeks. Your honour could be darkened by it, Then it is darkened. His jaw shot forward, stubborn. They are fools if they let my glory rise or fall on this. But Odysseus. His eyes, green as spring leaves, met mine. Patroclus, I have given enough to them. I will not give them this. After that, there was nothing more to say. The next day, with the southern wind caught in our sail, we found Odysseus by the prow. "Prince of Ithaca," Achilles said. His voice was formal, there were none of the boyish smiles from the day before. "I wish to hear you speak of Agamemnon and the other kings. I would know the men I am to join, and the princes I am to fight." "Very well, Prince Achilles." If Odysseus noticed a change, he did not comment on it. He led us to the benches at the base of the mast below the big-bellied sail. "Now, where to begin?" Almost absently, he rubbed the scar on his leg. It was starker in daylight, hairless and puckered. "There is Menelaus, whose wife we go to retrieve. After Helen picked him for her husband, Patroclus can tell you about that, he became king of Sparta. He is known as a good man, fearless in battle and well-liked in the world. Many kings have rallied to his cause, and not just those who are bound to their oaths." "Such as?" Achilles asked. Odysseus counted them off on his large farmer's hands. "Meriones, Idomeneus, Philoctetes, Ajax, both Ajaxes, larger and lesser. One was the man I remembered from Tyndareus's hall, a huge man with a shield. The other I did not know. Old King Nestor of Pylos will be there as well." I'd heard the name. He had sailed with Jason in his youth to find the Golden Fleece. He was long past his fighting days now, but brought his sons to war, and his council too. Achilles' face was intent, his eyes dark. "And the Trojans?" "Priam, of course, king of Troy. The man is said to have 50 sons, all raised with a sword in their hands." 50 sons? And 50 daughters. He's known to be pious and much loved by the gods. His sons are famous in their own right. Paris, of course, beloved of the goddess Aphrodite, and much noted for his beauty. Even the youngest, who's barely 10, is supposed to be ferocious, Troilus, I think. They have a god-born cousin who fights for them too. Aeneas, his name is, a child of Aphrodite herself. What about Hector? Achilles' eyes never left Odysseus. Priam's older son and heir, favourite of the god Apollo, Troy's mightiest defender. What does he look like? Odysseus shrugged. I don't know. They say he is large, but that is said of most heroes. You'll meet him before I do, so you'll have to tell me. Achilles narrowed his eyes. Why do you say that? Odysseus made a wry face. As I am sure Diomedes will agree, I am a competent soldier, but no more. My talents lie elsewhere. If I were to meet Hector in battle, I would not be bringing back news of him. You, of course, are a different matter. You will win the greatest fame from his death. My skin went cold. Perhaps I would, but I see no reason to kill him, Achilles answered coolly. He's done nothing to me. Odysseus chuckled, as if a joke had been made. If every soldier killed only those who'd personally offended him, Pylades, we'd have no wars at all. He lifted an eyebrow. Though maybe it's not such a bad idea. In that world, perhaps I'd be Aristos Achaeon instead of you. Achilles did not answer. He had turned to look over the ship's side at the waves beyond. The light fell upon his cheek, lit it to glowing. You have told me nothing of Agamemnon, he said. Yes, our mighty king of Mycenae. Odysseus leaned back again, proud scion of the house of Atreus. His great-grandfather, Tantalus, was a son of Zeus. Surely you've heard his story. All knew of Tantalus's eternal torment. To punish his contempt for their powers, the gods had thrown him into the deepest pit of the underworld. There, they afflicted the king with perpetual thirst and hunger, while food and drink sat just out of his reach. I've heard of him, but I never knew what his crime was, Achilles said. Well, in the days of King Tantalus, all our kingdoms were the same size, and the kings were at peace. But Tantalus grew dissatisfied with his portion, and began to take his neighbours' lands by force. His holdings doubled, then doubled again, but still Tantalus was not satisfied. His success had made him proud, and having bested all men who came before him, he sought next to best the gods themselves, not with weapons, for no man may match the gods in battle, but in trickery. He wished to prove that the gods do not know all, as they say they do. So he called his son to him, Pelops, and asked him if he wanted to help his father. Of course, Pelops said. His father smiled and drew his sword. With a single blow, he slit his son's throat clean across. He carved the body into careful pieces and spitted them over the fire. My stomach heaved at the thought of the iron skewer through the boy's dead flesh. When the boy was cooked, Tantalus called to his father Zeus on Olympus. "Father," he said, "I have prepared a feast to honour you and all your kin. Hurry, for the meat is tender still, and fresh." The gods loved such feasting, and came quickly to Tantalus's hall. But when they arrived, the smell of the cooking meat, normally so dear, seemed to choke them. At once Zeus knew what had been done. He seized Tantalus by the legs and threw him into Tartarus to suffer his eternal punishment. The sky was bright, and the wind brisk, but in the spell of Odysseus's story I felt that we were by a fireside, with night pressing all around. Zeus then drew the pieces of the boy back together, and breathed a second life into him. Pelops, though only a boy, became king of Mycenae. He was a good king, distinguished in piety and wisdom, yet many miseries afflicted his reign. Some said that the gods had cursed Tantalus's line, condemning them all to violence and disaster. Pelops' sons, Atreus and Thyestes, were born with their grandfather's ambition, and their crimes were dark and bloody, as his had been. A daughter raped by her father, a son cooked and eaten, all in their bitter rivalry for the throne. It is only now, by the virtue of Agamemnon and Menelaus, that their family fortune has begun to change. The days of civil war are gone, and Mycenae prospers under Agamemnon's upright rule. He has won just renown for his skill with the spear and the firmness of his leadership. We are fortunate to have him as our general. I had thought Achilles was no longer listening, but he turned now, frowning. "We are each generals." "Of course," Odysseus agreed. "But we are all going to fight the same enemy, are we not? 24 generals on one battlefield will be chaos and defeat." He offered a grin. "You know how well we all get along. We'd probably end up killing each other instead of the Trojans. Success in such a war as this comes only through men sewn to a single purpose, funneled to a single spear thrust, rather than 1,000 needle pricks. You lead the Thyians, and I the Ithacans, but there must be someone who uses us each to our abilities." He tipped a gracious hand towards Achilles. "However great they may be." Achilles ignored the compliment. The setting sun cut shadows into his face. His eyes were flat and hard. "I come of my free will, Prince of Ithaca. I will take Agamemnon's counsel, but not his orders. I would have you understand this." Odysseus shook his head. "God save us from ourselves. Not even in battle yet, and already worrying over honours." "I am not—" Odysseus waved a hand. "Believe me, Agamemnon understands your great worth to his cause. It was he who first wished you to come. You will be welcome to our army with all the pomp you could desire." It was not what Achilles had meant exactly, but it was close enough. I was glad when the lookout shouted landfall up ahead. That evening, when we had set aside our dinners, Achilles lay back on the bed. "What do you think of these men we will meet?" "I don't know." "I'm glad Diomedes is gone, at least." "Me too." We had let the king off at Euboea's northern tip to wait for his army from Argos. I do not trust them. "I suppose we'll know soon enough what they are like," he said.
We were silent a moment, thinking of that. Outside we could hear the beginnings of rain, soft, barely sounding on the tent roof.
Odysseus said it would storm tonight.
An Aegean storm, quickly here and quickly gone. Our boat was safely beached and tomorrow would be clear again. Achilles was looking at me.
Your hair never quite lies flat here.
He touched my head just behind my ear.
I don't think I've ever told you how I like it.
My scalp prickled where his fingers had been.
You haven't, I said.
I should have. His hand drifted down to the V at the base of my throat, drew softly across the pulse.
What about this? Have I told you what I think of this? Just here?
No, I said.
This, surely then.
His hand moved across the muscles of my chest, my skin warmed beneath it.
Have I told you of this?
That you have told me. My breath caught a little as I spoke.
And what of this?
His hand lingered over my hips, drew down the line of my thigh.
Have I spoken of it?
You have.
And this? Surely I would not have forgotten this.
His cat's smile.
Tell me I did not.
You did not.
There is this, too.
His hand was ceaseless now.
I know I have told you of this.
I closed my eyes. Tell me again, I said. Later, Achilles sleeps next to me. Odysseus's storm has come, and the coarse fabric of the tent wall trembles with its force. I hear the stinging slap, over and over, of waves reproaching the shore. He stirs, and the air stirs with him, bearing the musk-sweet smell of his body. I think, this is what I will miss. I think, I will kill myself rather than miss it. I think, how long do we have? Chapter 16. We arrived in Phthia the next day. The sun was just over the meridian, and Achilles and I stood looking at the rail.
Do you see that?
What? As always, his eyes were sharper than mine.
The shore. It looks strange.
As we drew closer, we saw why. It was thick with people, jostling impatiently, craning their necks towards us. And the sound. At first it seemed to come from the waves, or the ship as it cut them, a rushing roar. But it grew louder with each stroke of our oars, until we understood that it was voices, then words. Over and over it came. Prince Achilles, Aristo-Sicyon. As our ship touched the beach, hundreds of hands threw themselves into the air, and hundreds of throats opened in a cheer. All other noises, the wood of the gangplank banging down on rock, the sailors' commands, were lost to it. We stared in shock. It was that moment, perhaps, that our lives changed. Not before in Skyros, nor before that still on Pelion, but here, as we began to understand the grandness, now and always, that would follow him wherever he went. He had chosen to become a legend, and this was the beginning. He hesitated, and I touched my hand to his, where the crowd could not see it. Go, I urged him. They are waiting for you. Achilles stepped forward onto the gangplank, his arm lifted in greeting, and the crowd screamed itself hoarse. I half feared they would swarm onto the ship, but soldiers pushed forward and lined the gangway, making a path straight through the crush. Achilles turned back to me, said something. I could not hear it, but I understood. Come with me. I nodded, and we began to walk. On either side of us, the crowd surged against the soldiers' barrier. At the aisle's end was Peleus, waiting for us. His face was wet, and he made no attempt to wipe aside the tears. He drew Achilles to him, held him long before he let him go.
Our prince has returned.
His voice was deeper than I remembered, resonant and carrying far over the noise of the crowd. They quieted to hear the words of their king.
Before you all, I offer welcome to my most beloved son, sole heir to my kingdom. He will lead you to Troy in glory. He will return home in triumph." Even there, beneath the bright sun, I felt my skin go cold. He will not come home at all. But Peleus did not know this, yet. "He is a man grown, and God born, Aristos Achaean." There was no time to think of it now. The soldiers were beating on their shields with their spears, the women screamed, the men howled. I caught sight of Achilles' face. The look on it was stunned, but not displeased. He was standing differently, I noticed, shoulders back and legs braced. He looked older somehow, taller even. He leaned over to say something in his father's ear, but I could not hear what he said. A chariot was waiting. We stepped into it and watched the crowd stream behind us up the beach. Inside the palace, attendants and servants buzzed around us. We were given a moment to eat and drink what was pressed into our hands. Then we were led to the palace courtyard, where 2,500 men waited for us. At our approach, they lifted their square shields, shining like carapace, in salute to their new general. This, out of all of it, was perhaps the strangest, that he was their commander now. He would be expected to know them all, their names and armor and stories. He no longer belongs to me alone. If he was nervous, even I could not tell. I watched as he greeted them, spoke ringing words that made them stand up straighter. They grinned, loving every inch of their miraculous prince, his gleaming hair, his deadly hands, his nimble feet. They leaned towards him like flowers to the sun, drinking in his luster. It was as Odysseus had said. He had light enough to make heroes of them all. We were never alone. Achilles was always needed for something. His eye on draft sheets and figures, his advice on food supplies and levy lists. Phoenix, his father's old counselor, would be accompanying us. But there were still 1,000 questions for Achilles to answer. How many? How much? Who will be your captains? He did what he could, then announced, "I defer all the rest of such matters to the experience of Phoenix." I heard a servant girl sigh behind me, handsome and gracious both. He knew that I had little to do here. His face, when he turned to me, was increasingly apologetic. He was always sure to place the tablets where I could see them too, to ask my opinion, but I did not make it easy for him, standing in the back, listless and silent. Even there I could not escape. Through every window came the constant clatter of soldiers, bragging and drilling and sharpening their spears. The Myrmidons, they had begun calling themselves, Ant-Men, an old nickname of honor. Another thing Achilles had had to explain to me, the legend of Zeus creating the first Thyans from ants. I watched them marching, rank on cheerful rank. I saw them dreaming of the plunder they would bring home and the triumph. There was no such dream for us. I began to slip away. I would find a reason to linger behind as the attendants ushered him forward, an itch or a loose strap of my shoe. Oblivious, they hurried on, turned a corner, and left me suddenly, blessedly alone. I took the twisting corridors I had learned so many years ago and came gratefully to our empty room. There I lay on the cool stone of the floor and closed my eyes. I could not stop imagining how it would end. Spear tip or sword point, or smashed by a chariot. The rushing, unending blood of his heart. One night, in the second week, as we lay half-drowsing, I asked him, "How will you tell your father about the prophecy?" The words were loud in the silence of midnight. For a moment he was still. Then he said, "I do not think I will." "Never?" He shook his head, just the barest shadow. "There is nothing he can do. It would only bring him grief." "What about your mother? Won't she tell him?" "No," he said. "It was one of the things I asked her to promise me, that last day on Skyros." I frowned.
He had not told me this before. What were the other things? I saw him hesitate, but we did not lie to each other. We never had. I asked her to protect you, he said. After. I stared at him dry-mouthed. What did she say? Another silence. Then, so quietly I could imagine the dull red shame of his cheeks, he answered. She said no. Later, when he slept, and I lay wakeful and watching under the stars, I thought of this. Knowing that he had asked warmed me. It chased away some of the coldness of the days here in the palace, when he was wanted every moment and I was not. As for the goddess's answer, I did not care. I would have no need of her. I did not plan to live after he was gone. 6 weeks passed, the 6 weeks that it took to organize soldiers, to equip a fleet, to pack up food and clothing to last the length of the war. A year perhaps, or 2. Sieges were always long. Peleus insisted that Achilles take only the best. He paid for a small fortune in armor, more than 6 men would need. There were hammered bronze breastplates, graven with lions and a rising phoenix, stiff leather greaves with gold bands, horsehair plumed helms, a silver-forged sword, dozens of spearheads, and 2 light-wheeled chariots. With this came a 4-horse team, including the pair given to Peleus by the gods at his wedding. Xanthos and Balios they were called, Golden and Apple, and their eyes rolled white with impatience whenever they were not free to run. He also gave us a charioteer, a boy younger than we were, but sturdily built and said to be skilled with headstrong horses. Automedon his name was. Finally, last of all, a long spear, ash sapling peeled of bark and polished until it glowed like grey flame. From Chiron, Peleus said, handing it to his son. We bent over it, our fingers trailing its surface as if to catch the centaur's lingering presence. Such a fine gift would have taken weeks of Chiron's deft shaping. He must have begun it almost the day that we left. Did he know, or only guess at Achilles' destiny? As he lay alone in his rose-coloured cave, had some glimmer of prophecy come to him? Perhaps he simply assumed, a bitterness of habit, of boy after boy trained for music and medicine, and unleashed for murder. Yet this beautiful spear had been fashioned not in bitterness, but love. Its shape would fit no one's hand but Achilles, and its heft could suit no one's strength but his. And though the point was keen and deadly, the wood itself slipped under our fingers like the slender oiled strut of a lyre. At last the day for our departure came. Our ship was a beauty, finer even than Odysseus's. Sleek and slim as a knife point, meant to cut the sea. It rode low in the water, heavy with stores of food and supplies. And that was only the flagship. Beside it, 49 others, a city of wood, rolled gently in the waters of Thyia's harbour. Their bright prow pieces were a bestiary of animals and nymphs and creatures half in between, and their masts stood as tall as the trees they had been. At the front of each of these ships, one of our new-minted captains stood at attention, saluting as we walked up the ramp to our vessel. Achilles went first, his purple cloak stirring in the breeze from the sea, then Phoenix, and me with a new cloak of my own, holding the old man's arm to steady his steps. The people cheered for us and for our soldiers, filing on to their own ships. All around us, final promises were shouted, of glory, of the gold that would be stripped and brought home from Priam's rich city. Peleus stood at the shore's edge, one hand raised in farewell. True to his word, Achilles had not told him of the prophecy, merely hugged him tightly, as if to soak the old man into his skin. I had embraced him too, those thin, wiry limbs. I thought, this is what Achilles will feel like when he is old. And then I remembered, he will never be old. The ship's boards were still sticky with new resin. We leaned over the railing to wave our last farewell, the sun-warm wood pressed against our bellies. The sailors heaved up the anchor, square and chalky with barnacles, and loosened the sails. Then they took their seats at the oars that fringed the boat like eyelashes, waiting for the count. The drums began to beat, and the oars lifted and fell, taking us to Troy. Chapter 17. But first, to Aulis. Aulis, a jutting finger of land with enough shoreline to beach all our ships at once. Agamemnon had wanted his mighty force assembled in a single place before it sailed, a symbol, perhaps, the visible power of Greece offended. After 5 days churning through the rough waters of the Euboean coast, we came around the last hitch of the winding strait, and Aulis was there. It appeared all at once, as if a veil had been yanked off. Shoreline thick with vessels in every size and colour and shape, its beach covered in a shifting carpet of thousands upon thousands of men. Beyond them, the canvas tops of tents stretched out to the horizon, bright pennants marking the king's pavilions. Our men strove at their oars, guiding us towards the last empty place on the crowded shore, big enough for our whole fleet. Anchors dropped from 50 sterns. Horns blew. The myrmidons from the other ships were already wading ashore. They stood now at the water's edge, surrounding us, white tunics billowing. At a signal we could not see, they began to chant their prince's name, 2,500 men speaking as one, Achilles. All along the shore, heads turned, Spartans, Argives, Mycenaeans, and all the rest. The news went rippling through them, passing one to another. Achilles is here. As the sailors lowered the gangway, we watched them gather, kings and conscripts both. I could not see the princely faces from the distance, but I recognized the pennants that their squires carried before them, the yellow banner of Odysseus, the blue of Diomedes, and then the brightest, the biggest, a lion on purple, the symbol of Agamemnon and Mycenae. Achilles looked to me, drew in a breath. The screaming crowd at Thyia was nothing compared to this, but he was ready. I saw it in the way he lifted his chest, in the fierce green of his eyes. He walked to the gangway and stood at its top. The myrmidons kept up their shouts, and they were not alone now. Others in the crowd had joined them. A broad-chested myrmidon captain cupped his hands around his mouth. "Prince Achilles, son of King Peleus and the goddess Thetis! Aristos, Achaeon!" As if in answer the air changed. Bright sunlight broke and poured over Achilles, went rolling down his hair and back and skin, turning him to gold. He seemed suddenly larger, and his tunic, wrinkled from travel, straightened until it shone white and clean as a sail. His hair caught the light like buoyant flame. Gasps amongst the men, new cheers burst forth. Thetis, I thought. It could be no one else. She was pulling his divinity forth, mantling it like cream on every inch of his skin, helping her son make the most of his dearly bought fame. I could see the tug of a smile at the corner of his mouth. He was enjoying it, licking the crowd's worship off his lips. He did not know, he told me later, what was happening, but he did not question it. It did not seem strange to him. A pathway had been left open for him, straight through the crowd's heart to where the kings gathered. Each arriving prince was to present himself before his peers and new commander. Now it was Achilles' turn. He strode down the plank and past the jostling ranks of men, stopping perhaps 10 feet from the kings. I was a few paces farther behind. Agamemnon was waiting for us. His nose was curved and sharp like an eagle's beak, and his eyes glittered with a greedy intelligence. He was solid and broad across his chest, firmly planted in his feet. He looked seasoned, but also worn, older than the 40 years we knew him to be. At his right side, a place of honor, stood Odysseus and Diomedes. On his left was his brother, Menelaus, king of Sparta, cause of war. The vivid red hair that I remembered from Tyndareus's hall was touched now with threading grey. Like his brother, he was tall and square, his shoulders strong as a yoke ox. His family's dark eyes and curving nose seemed softer on him, more temperate. His face was smile-lined and handsome, where his brother's was not. The only other king that I could identify with any surety was Nestor, the old man. Chin barely covered by a sparse white beard, eyes sharp in his age-whittled face. He was the oldest man living, it was rumoured, the canny survivor of 1,000 scandals and battles and coups. He ruled the sandy strip of Pylos, whose throne he still clutched stubbornly, disappointing dozens of sons who grew old and then older, even as he bred new ones from his famed and well-worn loins. It was 2 of these sons who held his arms steady now, shouldering other kings aside for a place at the front. As he watched us, his mouth hung open, breath puffing his threadbare beard with excitement. He loved a commotion. Agamemnon stepped forward. He opened his hands in a gesture of welcome and stood regally expectant, waiting for the bows, obeisance, and oaths of loyalty he was owed. It was Achilles' place to kneel and offer them. He did not kneel. He did not call out a greeting to the great king, or incline his head, or offer a gift. He did nothing but stand straight, chin proudly lifted before them all. Agamemnon's jaw tightened. He looked silly like that, with his arms out, and he knew it. My gaze caught on Odysseus and Diomedes. Their eyes were sending sharp messages. Around us, the uneasy silence spread. Men exchanged glances. My hands clutched each other behind my back as I watched Achilles and the game he played. His face seemed cut from stone as he stared his warning at the king of Mycenae. You do not command me. The silence went on and on, painful and breathless, like a singer overreaching to finish a phrase. Then, just as Odysseus moved forward to intervene, Achilles spoke. I am Achilles, son of Peleus, god-born, best of the Greeks, he said. I have come to bring you victory. A second of startled silence. Then the men roared their approval. Pride became us. Heroes were never modest. Agamemnon's eyes went flat, and then Odysseus was there, his hand hard on Achilles' shoulder, wrinkling the fabric as his voice smoothed the air. Agamemnon, lord of men, we have brought the Prince Achilles to pledge his allegiance to you. His look warned Achilles, it is not too late. But Achilles simply smiled and stepped forward so that Odysseus's hand fell off him. I come freely to offer my aid to your cause, he said loudly. Then turning to the crowd around him, I am honored to fight with so many noble warriors of our kingdoms. Another cheer, loud and long, taking what felt like minutes to die. Finally, from the deep crag of his face, Agamemnon spoke, with patience that had been hard won, hard practiced. Indeed, I have the finest army in the world, and I welcome you to it, young Prince of Phthia. His smile cut sharply. It is a pity you were so slow to come. There was implication here, but Achilles had no chance to answer. Agamemnon was already speaking again, his voice lifted over us all. Men of Greece, we have delayed long enough. We leave for Troy tomorrow. Repair to your camps and make yourselves ready. Then he turned with finality and strode up the beach. The kings of Agamemnon's innermost circle followed him, dispersing back to their ships, Odysseus, Diomedes, Nestor, Menelaus, more. But others lingered to meet the new hero, Thessalian Eurypylus and Antilochus of Pylos, Meriones of Crete, and the physician Podalirius. Men drawn here for glory or bound by their oath, from every far-flung crag of our countries. Many had been here for months, waiting as the rest of the army straggled together. After such tedium, they said, looking slyly at Achilles, they welcomed any harmless entertainment, particularly at the expense of— Prince Achilles, interrupted Phoenix,
Please excuse my intrusion. I thought you would wish to know that your camp is being prepared.
His voice was stiff with disapproval, but here, in front of the others, he would not chide.
Thank you, worthy Phoenix, Achilles said. If you'll pardon us.
Yes, of course they would. They'd come by later or tomorrow. They'd bring their best wine and we'd broach it together. Achilles clasped hands with them, promised it would be so. In camp, myrmidons streamed around us hefting baggage and food, poles and canvas. A man in livery approached and bowed, one of Menelaus's heralds. His king could not come in person, he regretted, but had sent the herald here in his place to welcome us. Achilles and I exchanged a glance. This was clever diplomacy. We had not made a friend in his brother, so Menelaus did not come himself. Yet, some welcome was due to the best of the Greeks. A man who plays both sides of the fence, I whispered to Achilles.
A man who cannot afford to offend me if he wants his wife returned, he whispered back.
Would we accept a tour? The herald asked. Yes, we said, in our best princely manner. We would. The main encampment was a dizzying chaos, a bedlam of motion, the constant fluttering of pennants, laundry on lines, tent walls, the hurrying bodies of thousands and thousands of men. Beyond this was the river, with its old watermark from when the armies had first arrived, a foot higher on the bank. Then the marketplace centre, the agora, with its altar and makeshift podium. Last, the latrines, long open ditches busy with men. Wherever we went, we were observed. I watched Achilles closely, waiting to see if Thetis would again make his hair brighter or his muscles bigger. If she did, I did not notice. All the grace I saw then was his own, simple, unadorned, glorious. He waved to the men who stared at him. He smiled and greeted them as he passed. I heard the words, whispered from behind beards and broken teeth and calloused hands. Aristos Achaean. Was he as Odysseus and Diomedes had promised? Did they believe those slender limbs could hold against an army of Trojans? Could a boy of 16 really be our greatest warrior? And everywhere, as I watched the questions, I saw also the answers. Yes, they nodded to each other. Yes, yes. Chapter 18. I woke that night gasping. I was sweat-soaked, and the tent felt oppressively warm. Beside me, Achilles slept, his skin as damp as mine. I stepped outside, eager for a breeze off the water. But here, too, the air was heavy and humid. It was quiet, strangely so. I heard no flapping of canvas, no jingle of an unsecured harness. Even the sea was silent, as if the waves had ceased to fall against the shore. Out beyond the breakers, it was flat as a polished bronze mirror. There was no wind, I realized. That was the strangeness. The air that hung around me did not stir, even with the faintest whisper of current. I remember thinking, if it keeps up like this, we won't be able to sail tomorrow. I washed my face, glad of the water's coolness, then returned to Achilles and restless, turning sleep. The next morning is the same. I wake in a pool of sweat, my skin puckered and parched. Gratefully, I gulp the water that Automedon brings us. Achilles wakes, draws a hand over his soaked forehead. He frowns, goes outside, returns.
There is no wind.
I nod.
We will not leave today.
Our men are strong oarsmen, but even they cannot power a full day's journey. We need the wind to take us to Troy. It does not come, not that day, or that night, or the next day either. Agamemnon is forced to stand in the marketplace and announce further delay. As soon as the wind returns, we will leave, he promises us.